The story of the Vikings begins not with the crash of battle axes or the terror of coastal raids, but in the quiet fjords and windswept plains of Scandinavia during the twilight years of the 8th century. Here, among the scattered settlements of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, a perfect storm of circumstances was brewing that would soon unleash upon the world one of history's most dynamic and far-reaching cultures. The term Viking itself derives from the Old Norse word Vikingr, meaning one who comes from the fjords, or pirate. Yet this simple definition barely captures the complexity of a people who would, over the course of 3 centuries, reshape the political, cultural, and economic landscape of medieval Europe and beyond. They were simultaneously feared raiders and skilled merchants, pagan warriors and accomplished poets, destroyers of monasteries, and founders of cities. To understand the Viking phenomenon, we must first journey back to the Scandinavian world of Oth. The late 8th century, a landscape shaped by geography, climate, and the gradual transformation of tribal societies into more complex political structures. The Scandinavian peninsula, with its intricate coastline of fjords, islands, and inlets, created natural boundaries that fostered the development of numerous small kingdoms and chieftainships. These geographical features also provided the perfect training ground for the maritime skills that would become the Vikings' greatest asset. The climate of this period, known to historians as the medieval warm period, was notably milder than the centuries that preceded and followed it. This warming trend, lasting roughly from 900 to 1300 CE, allowed for expanded agriculture in northern latitudes and made sea voyages more feasible during extended seasons. The combination of improved growing conditions and longer navigable seasons created population pressures that would drive expansion, while simultaneously providing the resources necessary to support it. Scandinavian society during this formative period was organized around the concept of the clan, or extended family group, led by chieftains who derived their authority from a combination of inherited status, personal prowess in battle, and their ability to provide for their followers through successful raids or trade expeditions. These societies were intensely hierarchical, yet also surprisingly mobile, with individuals able to rise in status through martial achievement. Successful commerce, or skillful poetry. The foundation of Viking culture rested upon several interconnected pillars that would define their civilization for centuries to come. First and foremost was their relationship with the sea. Unlike many contemporary European peoples who viewed the ocean as a barrier, the Scandinavians saw it as a highway. Their innovative shipbuilding techniques, refined over generations of coastal navigation, produced vessels that were simultaneously seaworthy enough for ocean voyages and shallow drafted enough to navigate rivers and make beach landings. Religious beliefs of pre-Christian Scandinavia provided another crucial foundation for Viking culture. The Norse pantheon, dominated by figures such as Odin the All-Father, Thor the Thunder God, and Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, emphasized concepts of fate, honor, and the warrior's path to glory. The belief in Valhalla, where warriors who died gloriously in battle would feast and fight until the end of the world, created a cultural framework that not only accepted but actively encouraged martial risk-taking. Perhaps equally important was the Norse legal tradition embodied in the concept of the Thing, democratic assemblies where free men could voice opinions, settle disputes, and make collective decisions. These gatherings, whether local, regional, or kingdom-wide, created a political culture that balanced individual ambition with collective responsibility, and provided mechanisms for resolving conflicts without necessarily resorting to violence. Economic foundations of Viking society were surprisingly diverse and sophisticated. While popular imagination often focuses on their raiding activities, the reality is that most Vikings were farmers, craftsmen, and traders. The harsh northern climate and short growing seasons demanded careful resource management and encouraged the development of specialized skills in metalworking, wood carving, textile production, and other crafts that could be traded for necessities not available locally. The transition from the late Iron Age to what historians call the Viking Age was not sudden but gradual, marked by increasing contact with the wider European world through trade networks that stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence suggests that Scandinavian merchants were active in international commerce long before their warriors became infamous for their raids. Amber from the Baltic, furs from the far north, and iron weapons forged with superior Scandinavian techniques found markets throughout Europe, creating wealth that supported larger populations and more complex social structures. The catalyst that transformed these regional trading networks into the explosive expansion we associate with the Viking Age came from external pressures and internal developments that converged in the late 8th century. The consolidation of kingdoms under increasingly powerful rulers created competition for resources and status that could no longer be satisfied within traditional Scandinavian territories. Meanwhile, the growth of wealthy, poorly defended targets in neighboring lands presented opportunities that seemed almost too tempting to resist. The first recorded Viking raid, the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 CE, was not an isolated incident, but rather the opening movement of a symphony of expansion that would play out across 3 centuries. This raid, striking at one of Northumbria's most sacred sites, sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world and announced the arrival of a new force in European affairs. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles entry for the year 793 captures the horror and bewilderment that greeted this unprecedented assault. In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and miserably frightened the inhabitants. These were exceptional. Flashes of lightning and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air, and soon followed a great famine. And a little after that, in the same year, the harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. Yet to understand why Lindisfarne became the target of this epical raid, we must appreciate both its significance to the Christian world and its vulnerability from a Viking perspective. The monastery, situated on Holy Island off the Northumbrian coast, was one of the most important centers of Christian learning and pilgrimage in northern England. Founded by Saint Aidan in 635 CE, it had produced the magnificent Lindisfarne Gospels and served as the final resting place of Saint Cuthbert, one of medieval England's most venerated saints. From a practical standpoint, however, Lindisfarne represented an almost irresistible target for Viking raiders. The monastery was wealthy, holding extensive lands and treasures, accumulated through centuries of royal patronage and pilgrim donations. It was isolated, accessible primarily by a causeway that could be cut off at high tide and defended only by monks who had taken vows of peace. Most crucially, it was located along well-established sea routes that Scandinavian traders had been using for generations, making it both familiar territory and easily accessible to longships approaching from the North Sea. The success of the Lindisfarne raid established a template that would be replicated countless times across the next century. The Vikings had discovered that the wealth accumulated by Christian monasteries and trading centers could be seized with relatively little risk, provided they could achieve the crucial elements of surprise and mobility. Their ships allowed them to appear suddenly along coastlines, strike quickly at poorly defended targets, and disappear before organized resistance could be mounted. The immediate aftermath of Lindisfarne saw a rapid expansion of Viking raiding activity throughout the British Isles and along the European coast. In 794, raiders struck the monastery at Jarrow, where the Venerable Bede had lived and worked. In 795, they attacked Rathlin Island off the Irish coast and the monastery of Iona in Scotland. By the early 9th century, Viking fleets were operating as far south as the Loire Valley in France and had established regular, seasonal raiding patterns that anticipated the movement of merchant ships and the agricultural cycles that determined when monasteries and towns would be most prosperous. These early raids reveal sophisticated planning and coordination that challenges the popular image of Vikings as mindless barbarians driven purely by bloodlust and greed. Archaeological analysis of Viking camps and the distribution of raided sites suggests that expeditions were carefully planned enterprises that required significant investment in ships, weapons, and provisions. The raiders possessed detailed knowledge of their targets, including the best times to attack, the most valuable items to seek, and the quickest escape routes. The social organization of these raiding expeditions reflected the hierarchical yet merit-based structure of Scandinavian society. A successful raid required leadership that could inspire confidence, plan effectively, and distribute rewards fairly among participants. The leader, or jarl, typically provided the ship and initial investment, while individual warriors contributed their skills, weapons, and commitment to the enterprise. Profits were distributed according to predetermined shares that reflected each participant's contribution and status, creating incentives for both leadership and followership. The weapons and equipment used by these early Viking raiders represented the cutting edge of 9th century military technology. The iconic Viking sword, with its pattern-welded blade and distinctive pommel, was both a practical weapon and a symbol of status. These swords were often given names and treated as heirloom objects passed down through generations. The round, wooden shield, reinforced with iron and featuring a distinctive boss at the center, provided effective protection while remaining light enough for shipboard combat. The battle axe, perhaps the most distinctively Scandinavian weapon, combined practical utility for shipboard tasks with devastating effectiveness in close combat. Viking defensive equipment was notably lighter and more flexible than the heavy armor worn by Carolingian knights of the same period. Most warriors wore simple conical helmets and mail shirts, though wealthier individuals might possess more elaborate protection. This emphasis on mobility over heavy defense reflected both the tactical requirements of their raiding style and the practical constraints of sea-based warfare. The psychological impact of these early raids extended far beyond their immediate material damage. The Vikings' sudden appearance, fierce fighting style, and pagan religious practices created a terror that was magnified by Christian interpretations of their attacks as divine punishment for sin. The image of dragon-prowed ships emerging from morning mist to disgorge wild-haired warriors became a recurring nightmare for coastal communities throughout northern Europe. Yet even as Viking raids intensified during the early 9th century, other Scandinavians were pursuing very different forms of expansion. Swedish traders were establishing commercial networks that stretched deep into Eastern Europe, following river routes through what is now Russia toward the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. These merchant adventurers, known in Slavic languages as Rus, from which the name Russia derives, created trading posts that would eventually evolve into major cities like Novgorod and Kiev. The Danish kingdoms, meanwhile, were undergoing internal consolidation that would soon transform the nature of Viking activity from seasonal raiding to permanent conquest and settlement. The rise of powerful rulers like Godfred and later Horik I created the organizational capacity for larger, more sustained military campaigns that could field entire armies rather than just raiding bands. This evolution from raiding to conquest became most apparent during the middle decades of the 9th century, when Viking activity entered what historians call the Great Army phase. Rather than returning home each winter, Viking forces began establishing permanent bases that allowed them to campaign year-round and accumulate the resources necessary for territorial conquest rather than mere plunder. The transformation of Viking activity from seasonal raiding to permanent conquest reached its culmination with the arrival of What the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle termed the Great Heathen Army in England in 865 CE, this force, led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, represented a new phase in Viking expansion that would fundamentally alter the political map of medieval Europe. Unlike the hit-and-run tactics of earlier raiders, the Great Army came to stay. Contemporary sources describe a force of several thousand warriors, accompanied by support personnel, horses, and siege equipment that demonstrated their intention to conquer and hold territory rather than simply plunder and withdraw. This army established winter camps, collected tribute from local populations, and systematically worked to overthrow the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had dominated England for over 2 centuries. The strategic brilliance of the Great Army's campaign becomes clear when we examine their methodical approach to conquest. Rather than attempting to defeat all their enemies simultaneously, they employed a divide-and-conquer strategy that exploited the political divisions among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They would ally with one kingdom against another, collect payment for their services, and then turn against their former allies once the immediate threat was eliminated. The Kingdom of East Anglia fell first, in 869, when King Edmund was captured, and killed in circumstances that would later transform him into a Christian martyr. The Vikings then turned their attention to Mercia, the most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, forcing King Burgred into exile and installing a puppet ruler who would govern according to their wishes. By 876, most of England north and east of Watling Street had fallen under direct Viking control, creating what would become known as the Danelaw. Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great, provided the only effective resistance to this Viking expansion. Alfred's strategy combined military innovation with diplomatic skill and an understanding of Viking motivations that allowed him to transform potential conquerors into settlers and allies. His construction of burhs, fortified towns that could serve as refuges for local populations and bases for military operations, created a defensive network that made Viking conquest prohibitively expensive. The Treaty of Alfred in Guthrum, signed around 886 CE, formally recognized the division of England between Anglo-Saxon and Viking territories. This agreement established legal and cultural boundaries that would shape English development for centuries to come. Within the Danelaw, Viking law, customs, and administrative practices took root, creating a hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian culture that enriched both traditions. The process of Viking settlement involved far more than military conquest. Archaeological evidence from sites like York, Viking Jorvik, reveals the rapid development of sophisticated urban centers that combined Scandinavian craftsmanship with international trade networks. Jorvik became one of the largest and wealthiest cities in 10th century Europe, with a population exceeding 8,000 and commercial connections, stretching from Greenland to Constantinople. The transformation of warriors into farmers and merchants required significant adaptation on both sides. Viking settlers had to learn new agricultural techniques suited to English soil and climate, while Anglo-Saxon populations had to accommodate new legal systems, religious practices, and social customs. The linguistic evidence for this cultural blending is particularly striking. Old English absorbed hundreds of Scandinavian words, many of which remain in modern English, including fundamental terms like sky, knife, husband, and they. Viking women played crucial roles in this settlement process, though their stories are often overshadowed by the martial achievements of their male counterparts. Archaeological evidence from Viking grave sites reveals that women possessed significant wealth and status, often buried with elaborate jewelry, household goods, and sometimes even weapons. The concept of the shield maiden, women warriors, who fought alongside men, appears in both historical sources and legendary literature, though the extent to which this represented actual practice versus idealized storytelling remains Debated among scholars, the legal status of Viking women was notably progressive for its time. They could own property independently, request divorces, and participate in commercial activities. The famous runestones of Sweden often commemorate women who commissioned public works or managed family estates, suggesting that female authority was both recognized and celebrated within Scandinavian society. As Viking settlement in England stabilized during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, new generations of leaders emerged who combined Scandinavian military traditions with increasingly sophisticated political skills. Figures like Eric Bloodaxe, the last independent king of York, and the various rulers of Dublin's Viking kingdom demonstrated that Scandinavian political organization could adapt successfully to different geographical and cultural environments. Dublin Vikings, established initially as raiders in 841 CE, evolved into one of medieval Europe's most important commercial powers. Their strategic location allowed them to control trade between Scandinavia, Britain, and the Atlantic Islands, while their ships provided the primary means of transportation for goods and people throughout the Irish Sea region. Dublin's slave market became notorious throughout Europe, supplied by raids that extended from Scotland to Spain and feeding demand in markets as distant as Baghdad and Cairo. The integration of Viking settlers with local populations proceeded differently in various regions, influenced by factors such as population density, existing political structures, and the relative strength of Christian versus pagan religious traditions. In the Scottish Islands, Viking settlement was so complete that native Celtic languages virtually disappeared, replaced by Norse dialects that evolved into the distinctive Norn language that survived into the 18th century. The Faroe Islands and Iceland present perhaps the most interesting examples of Viking colonization, as these were largely uninhabited territories that allowed Scandinavian settlers to create societies based purely on their own cultural preferences without the need to accommodate existing populations. The Icelandic settlement, beginning around 874 CE, created what many historians consider the world's first parliamentary democracy through the establishment of the Althing in 930 CE. The Icelandic experiment in democratic governance reflected the sophisticated political culture that had developed within Scandinavian society. The Althing combined legislative, judicial, and social functions, serving as both a law-making body and a forum for resolving disputes through legal procedures rather than violence. This institution would survive for over 3 centuries and provide the foundation for the remarkable literary culture that produced the sagas and eddas that preserve our most detailed knowledge of Viking society and beliefs. The Icelandic sagas, composed primarily during the 12th and 13th centuries, but preserving much earlier oral traditions, provide an unparalleled window into the daily life, values, and worldview of Viking society. These narrative masterpieces, including works like Egil's Saga, Njál's Saga, and the Valsunga Saga, reveal a culture that valued storytelling as highly as swordplay, and where legal cunning was considered as admirable as physical prowess. Saga literature depicts a society obsessed with honor, reputation, and the complex web of obligations that bound individuals to their families, communities, and rulers. The concept of honor, or drengskaper, encompassed not only martial courage, but also honesty in business dealings, loyalty to friends, and the wisdom to know when compromise was preferable to conflict. A man's reputation, once lost, could never be fully recovered, making the preservation of honor a matter of vital importance that could justify extreme measures. Yet even as Vikings were establishing their remarkable literary tradition in Iceland, their kinsmen were pushing the boundaries of the known world through increasingly ambitious voyages of exploration. The settlement of Iceland had been facilitated by the exile of Norwegian nobles who refused to submit to King Harald Fairhair's consolidation of power, creating a population with both the resources and motivation to seek new opportunities beyond. The horizon. Erik the Red's discovery and settlement of Greenland, around 985 CE, represents one of history's most audacious colonization efforts. Banished from Iceland for manslaughter, Erik spent 3 years exploring the massive island's western coast before returning to recruit settlers for what he optimistically named Greenland. His marketing strategy, emphasizing the fertile valleys and promising hunting grounds while downplaying the harsh climate and geographical isolation, successfully attracted nearly 500 colonists, who established 2 main settlements on Greenland's southwestern coast. The Greenland colonies, though never numbering more than a few thousand inhabitants, survived for over 4 centuries and created a unique Arctic civilization that combined Scandinavian agricultural techniques with Inuit hunting strategies. Archaeological excavations at sites like Brattahlid, Erik's own farm, reveal sophisticated architectural adaptations to the Arctic environment, including innovative heating systems and storage facilities designed to preserve food through the long polar winters. The Greenland settlements also served as the launching point for the most famous of all Viking voyages, Leif Erikson's expedition to Vinland, around the year 1000 CE, following sailing directions provided by Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had sighted unknown lands to the west while being blown off course. Leif led a carefully planned expedition that resulted in the first confirmed European discovery of North America, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. The Vinland Sagas, preserved in both the Grenlandinga Saga and Eirik Saga Roe, provide detailed accounts of Viking attempts to establish permanent settlements in North America. These narratives describe 3 distinct regions encountered by the explorers. Helgeland, possibly Baffin Island, characterized by flat rocks and glaciers. Markland, likely Labrador, noted for its extensive forests. And Vinland itself, probably. Newfoundland, praised for its mild climate, abundant salmon, and wild grapes that gave the region its name. The archaeological discovery of Landsea, Meadows in Newfoundland, by Helge and Anne Stein Ingsted in the 1960s provided physical confirmation of the saga accounts. This site, dating to around 1000 CE, contains the remains of several Norse-style buildings, including a great hall, workshops, and storage areas that clearly indicate a planned settlement rather than a temporary camp. The artifacts recovered from the site, including iron nails, a bronze pin, and worked wood, conclusively demonstrate a Norse presence in North America centuries before any other known European contact. Yet despite their remarkable achievement in reaching North America, the Viking settlements in Vinland proved unsustainable. The sagas attribute their failure to conflicts with the indigenous peoples, whom they called Skrælings, as well as internal disputes among the colonists themselves. The practical challenges of maintaining supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean, combined with the small size of the colonizing force, made permanent settlement impossible with the technology and resources available to 11th century Scandinavians, while these western voyages captured the imagination of later generations. The eastern expansion of Swedish Vikings had far more lasting historical consequences. The rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, Dnieper, and Don, provided highways into the heart of the Eurasian continent, allowing Scandinavian merchants and warriors to establish trading networks that connected the Baltic Sea with Constantinople, Baghdad, and even Central Asia. These Eastern Vikings, known as the Russ, founded settlements that would evolve into some of Europe's most important cities. Novgorod, established around 859 CE, became the northern terminus of a trading network that carried amber, furs, honey, and slaves southward in exchange for silk, spices, silver, and luxury goods from the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Kiev, conquered by the Rus in 882 CE, developed into the political and commercial center of what would become the Kievan Rus state, the predecessor of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Rus' adaptation to their new environment required different skills and strategies than those employed by their Western counterparts. River travel demanded smaller, more maneuverable vessels than ocean-going longships, while the necessity of portaging boats between river systems created unique logistical challenges. The seasonal nature of river transport, with spring floods providing the only opportunity for heavily loaded vessels to navigate shallow waterways, imposed strict temporal constraints on commercial operations. The political organization that emerged among the Eastern Vikings reflected their role as a military and commercial elite ruling over predominantly Slavic populations. The Rus established fortified trading posts along major river routes, each controlled by a Druzhina warrior band, loyal to a local leader who owed allegiance to the great princes of Novgorod and Kiev. This system combined Scandinavian military traditions with administrative practices borrowed from both Byzantine and Islamic models. The cultural synthesis that developed in these eastern territories produced some of the most remarkable achievements of the Viking Age. The Rus quickly adopted Slavic languages for daily communication while maintaining Norse traditions in warfare, law, and royal ceremonial. Their religious practices blended Scandinavian paganism with Slavic folk beliefs and, eventually, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, following Prince Vladimir's conversion in 988. The wealth that flowed through these Eastern trading networks is documented in the hundreds of thousands of Islamic silver coins found in Scandinavian archaeological contexts. These dirhams, minted in places like Baghdad, Samarkand, and Cairo, demonstrate the truly global reach of Viking commercial activities and the sophisticated monetary economy that had developed to support long-distance trade. The economic impact of these Eastern trading networks extended far beyond simple commercial exchange to fundamentally reshape Scandinavian society itself. The enormous quantities of silver flowing northward from Islamic and Byzantine territories created unprecedented wealth concentrations that accelerated social stratification and political centralization throughout the Nordic kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from sites like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark reveals the emergence of a cosmopolitan merchant class whose graves contain luxury goods from across the known world. This influx of wealth coincided with, and perhaps catalyzed, a remarkable period of technological and artistic innovation within Scandinavian society. The distinctive art styles of the Viking Age, from the intricate animal interlace patterns of the Oseberg ship burial to the sophisticated narrative carvings of the Sigurd stones, reflect both indigenous Scandinavian traditions and influences, absorbed through extensive cultural contact with other civilizations. The famous Mammon style, named after a decorated axe head found in a Danish grave from around 970 CE, exemplifies this cultural synthesis. The intricate patterns that adorned everything from weapons to jewelry to wooden church staves combine traditional Germanic animal motifs with design elements clearly derived from Byzantine and Islamic artistic traditions, creating a uniquely Scandinavian aesthetic that would influence European decorative arts for centuries. The transformation of Viking society during the 10th and 11th centuries was perhaps most dramatically evident in the realm of religion. This gradual conversion to Christianity, beginning with the baptism of Danish King Harald Bluetooth around 960 CE, represented far more than a simple change of faith. It marked the integration of Scandinavian societies into the broader European cultural and political community, with consequences that extended to every aspect of social organization. The process of Christianization varied significantly across the Scandinavian world, influenced by political calculations, cultural resistance, and the practical challenges of replacing deeply rooted religious traditions. In Denmark, conversion proceeded relatively smoothly under royal patronage, with Christian churches often built directly atop pagan temples in symbolic assertions of the new faith's supremacy. The great runic stone erected by Harold Bluetooth at Jelling proudly proclaims his achievement in making the Danes Christian, while the elaborate burial mounds at the same site demonstrate the careful balance required between honoring ancestral traditions and embracing new beliefs. Norway's conversion proved more contentious, involving decades of civil warfare between Christian and pagan factions. King Olaf Tryggvason's aggressive evangelization campaigns in the late 10th century employed methods that included forced baptisms, destruction of pagan temples, and the execution of those who refused to abandon traditional religious practices. His successor, Olaf Haraldsson, later St. Olaf, continued these policies with such determination that he became known as the Eternal King of Norway. Following his death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, Sweden remained predominantly pagan, longer than its neighbors, with the great temple at Uppsala continuing to function as a center of Norse religious practice well into the 12th century. The German chronicler Adam of Bremen's famous description of this temple, with its golden idols of Odin, Thor, and Freyr, provides one of our most detailed accounts of late Viking Age paganism. Yet even in Sweden, Christian influence gradually penetrated through commercial contacts and royal marriages, creating a syncretic religious culture that persisted for generations. The adoption of Christianity brought fundamental changes to Viking society's legal and social structures. Christian concepts of individual moral responsibility challenged traditional clan-based justice systems, while ecclesiastical courts introduced new procedures for handling matters like marriage, inheritance, and oath-breaking. The Church's emphasis on written law codes gradually displaced oral legal traditions, creating more standardized and predictable judicial processes. Perhaps most significantly, Christianity provided a new framework for royal authority that transcended traditional clan loyalties. The concept of divine right monarchy, borrowed from Carolingian and Byzantine models, allowed Scandinavian kings to claim legitimacy, independent of tribal assemblies and warrior bands. This ideological transformation facilitated the political consolidation that would ultimately end the Viking Age by channeling martial energies into state building rather than external raiding. The reign of Canute the Great, 1016 to 1035, exemplified this new model of Christianized Viking kingship, ruling simultaneously over Denmark, England, and Norway. Canute demonstrated that Scandinavian military prowess could be combined with sophisticated administrative skills to create stable, prosperous kingdoms. His legal codes, influenced by both English and Scandinavian traditions, established precedents for governance that balanced royal authority with traditional rights and customs. Canute's North Sea Empire represented the culmination of Viking political achievement, yet it also revealed the limitations of personal monarchy in an age before developed bureaucratic institutions. The empire's collapse following Canute's death demonstrated that even the most successful Viking rulers remained dependent on personal relationships and military force rather than institutional structures capable of surviving dynastic transitions. Gradual transformation of Viking warfare during the 11th century reflected broader changes in European military technology and tactics. The adoption of heavy cavalry, influenced by contact with Frankish and Byzantine military practices, required new forms of social organization to support the expensive equipment and extensive training necessary for mounted combat. The traditional Viking emphasis on individual warrior prowess gave way to disciplined formations and coordinated tactics that demanded professional soldiers rather than seasonal raiders. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, where King Harald Hardrada of Norway was defeated and killed while attempting to conquer England, is often cited as marking the end of the Viking Age. Yet this dramatic conclusion to the age of Viking expansion had been building for decades as Scandinavian societies increasingly turned their attention inward to the challenges of state building. An economic development thought the evolution of Viking Age towns provides compelling evidence for this transformation. Sites like Trondheim, Bergen, and Stockholm evolved from seasonal trading posts into permanent urban centers with specialized craftsmen, resident merchants, and complex administrative structures. These towns became focal points for the new Christian kingdoms, supporting royal courts, episcopal sees, and the bureaucratic apparatus necessary for governing increasingly complex societies. The architectural legacy of this urban development is still visible today in the distinctive stave churches of Norway, which combine traditional Scandinavian woodworking techniques with Christian symbolic programs. These remarkable structures, with their soaring rooflines and intricate carved decorations, represent a uniquely Scandinavian response to Christian architectural requirements and demonstrate the continuing vitality of indigenous artistic traditions even after religious conversion. The maritime technology that had enabled Viking expansion continued to evolve throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, though increasingly in service of trade rather than conquest. Archaeological investigations of ship burials and harbor sites reveal progressive improvements in vessel design that prioritized cargo capacity and seaworthiness over the shallow draft and beach landing capabilities that had made Viking longships ideal for raiding. The transition from war vessels to merchant ships symbolized the broader transformation of Scandinavian society from a raiding culture to a commercial civilization. The famous skulldell of ships, discovered in Denmark's Roskilde Fjord and dating to the 11th century, illustrate this technological evolution. These 5 vessels, deliberately sunk to create a barrier across the fjord, include both traditional longships and the broader, deeper-hulled cargo vessels known as Nors. The Nor design, with its emphasis on storage space and stability in rough seas, became the standard for long-distance voyages and remained the backbone of Scandinavian commerce for centuries. The transformation of Viking society from raiders to traders was perhaps most visible in the great commercial centers that emerged during the late Viking Age. Bergen, founded around 1070 CE, became the hub of Norwegian trade with the Hanseatic League and the primary export point for the dried cod that would make Norway wealthy for centuries to come. The city's strategic location at the mouth of several major fjords allowed it to collect and redistribute goods from throughout western Norway, while its excellent harbor could accommodate the larger ships that dominated medieval international commerce. Stockholm's rise to prominence followed a similar pattern, as Swedish rulers recognized the advantages of controlling trade between the Baltic and the Faltic and the Sea, inland waterways that connected Scandinavia with Eastern Europe. The city's location on a series of islands provided natural fortification while offering multiple channels for shipping, making it an ideal location for a commercial center that needed to balance accessibility with security. The social implications of this commercial transformation extended far beyond the merchant class itself. The wealth generated by long-distance trade created new forms of social mobility that challenged traditional aristocratic hierarchies based purely on birth and martial prowess. Successful merchants could acquire the resources necessary to purchase land, build impressive residences, and patronize artistic and cultural projects that demonstrated their status within the community. This mercantile wealth also supported the development of specialized crafts that reached new levels of sophistication during the late Viking Age. Archaeological evidence from sites like Sigtuna in Sweden reveals workshops producing high-quality metalwork, jewelry, and decorative objects that combine traditional Scandinavian techniques with influences absorbed through international trade contacts. The famous silver arm rings found throughout Scandinavia, often decorated with intricate patterns and sometimes bearing inscriptions in runic script, served both as personal adornment and as a standardized medium of exchange in regions where coined money was not yet common. The runic writing system itself underwent significant development during this period, evolving from a primarily magical and commemorative script to a practical tool for recording commercial transactions, legal agreements, and personal correspondence. The thousands of runic inscriptions surviving from the Viking Age provide invaluable insights into daily life, social relationships, and economic activities that are rarely documented in formal historical sources. Many of these inscriptions commemorate ordinary people engaged in typical activities, merchants traveling to distant markets, pilgrims journeying to Christian holy sites, and farmers managing their estates. The Rack stone in Sweden, carved around 825 CE, contains over 700 runes in what is possibly the longest runic inscription ever created, combining mythological references with historical events in a complex narrative that demonstrates the sophisticated literary culture that had developed within Scandinavian society. The role of women in late Viking Age society becomes more visible through both runic inscriptions and archaeological evidence, revealing levels of authority and independence that were remarkable for medieval Europe. The famous Dinna stone from Norway, carved around 1040 CE, was commissioned by a woman named Gunvor to commemorate her daughter, and its elaborate decorative program suggests that women could command significant resources for public monuments. Archaeological excavations of wealthy female graves from this period reveal grave goods that include not only jewelry and household items, but also scales, weights, and keys that indicate involvement in commercial activities and household management. Some graves contain complete sets of gaming pieces, suggesting that board games were important social activities that crossed gender lines and may have served as metaphors for political and military strategy. The famous Burka female warrior grave, designated BJ 581, has sparked considerable scholarly debate about the extent to which women actually participated in Viking Age warfare. The burial contained a complete set of weapons, including a sword, spear, arrows, and shield, along with gaming pieces and evidence for horseback riding. While some scholars argue this represents a genuine shield maiden, others suggest the weapons may have been symbolic of authority rather than indicators of actual combat participation. The evidence for female authority extends beyond individual graves to include documentary sources that describe women managing estates, engaging in legal proceedings, and even leading military campaigns. The Icelandic sagas, despite their tendency toward literary embellishment, consistently portray women as active participants in political and economic affairs rather than passive dependents confined to domestic roles. The gradual integration of Scandinavian societies into European Christendom brought significant changes to marriage customs, inheritance practices, and family structures. Christian emphasis on monogamous marriage challenged traditional Norse practices that had allowed wealthy men to maintain multiple wives and concubines, while church doctrine regarding the indissolubility of marriage conflicted with Scandinavian legal traditions that permitted divorce under certain circumstances. These religious and legal transformations occurred gradually and unevenly across the Scandinavian world, with considerable regional variation in how Christian teachings were integrated with traditional customs. Archaeological evidence suggests that pagan burial practices persisted well into the Christian period, often combined with Christian symbols in ways that suggest syncretic religious beliefs rather than complete conversion to the new faith. Political consolidation of the Scandinavian kingdoms during the 11th and 12th centuries created new opportunities for cooperation and conflict among rulers who shared common cultural backgrounds but competed for territory, trade routes, and prestige. The concept of the North Sea Empire, pioneered by Canute, was repeatedly attempted by later rulers who sought to recreate his success in uniting Denmark, Norway, and England under a single crown. Magnus the Good of Norway briefly achieved this goal. In the 1040s, ruling both Norway and Denmark while maintaining claims to the English throne. His reign demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of personal monarchy in an age when royal authority depended heavily on the ruler's ability to maintain loyalty through successful military campaigns and generous distribution of rewards to supporters. The failure of successive attempts to recreate Canute's North Sea empire revealed the fundamental tensions between traditional Scandinavian political culture and the administrative requirements of governing large, diverse territories. The personal nature of royal authority, based on direct relationships between kings and their warrior followers, proved inadequate for managing complex multi-ethnic kingdoms that required sophisticated bureaucratic institutions and legal systems capable of accommodating different cultural traditions. Harold Hardrada's invasion of England in 1066 represented the last great attempt to achieve Viking-style conquest through traditional means. His defeat at Stamford Bridge, just 3 weeks before William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings, symbolically marked the end of the age when Scandinavian military superiority could overcome the increasingly sophisticated defenses and military organizations of their European neighbors. Harald's own career exemplified both the achievements and limitations of late Viking Age warrior culture. His early years were spent in the service of the Byzantine Empire, where he commanded the famous Varangian Guard and accumulated enormous wealth through campaigns in Sicily, Bulgaria, and the Eastern Mediterranean. His experiences in Constantinople exposed him to the most advanced military, administrative, and cultural practices of his time, knowledge that he later applied in his efforts to modernize the Norwegian kingdom. Yet despite his sophistication and resources, Harold's ultimate failure in England demonstrated that the age of Viking expansion had definitively ended. The political, military, and economic conditions that had made Viking raids and conquests possible had been fundamentally altered by the consolidation of European kingdoms, the development of more effective defensive strategies, and the integration of Scandinavian societies themselves into the broader European community. The transformation of the Varangian Guard from a primarily Scandinavian institution into a multi-ethnic force reflected these broader changes. Originally composed almost entirely of Swedish and Norwegian warriors seeking fortune in Byzantine service, the Guard gradually incorporated Anglo-Saxons fleeing Norman conquest, Rus from Eastern Europe, and eventually soldiers from throughout the Eastern Orthodox world. This evolution mirrored the declining role of Scandinavia as a source of military manpower for foreign rulers. The end of the Viking Age did not mean the disappearance of Scandinavian influence in European affairs, but rather its redirection into different channels. The consolidation of the Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish kingdoms created new forms of international engagement based on dynastic marriages, commercial treaties, and diplomatic alliances, rather than military conquest and territorial expansion. Reign of Valdemar I of Denmark, 1157 to 1182, illustrated this new approach to Scandinavian statecraft. Rather than launching raids against wealthy foreign targets, Valdemar focused on internal development, establishing new towns, promoting trade, and strengthening royal administration. His military campaigns were directed primarily against the Wendish peoples of the southern Baltic, reflecting Denmark's evolution from a raiding base into a territorial kingdom with defined borders to defend. Valdemar's partnership with the German Duke Henry the Lion in campaigns against the Slavic peoples demonstrated how Scandinavian rulers had learned to work within the emerging European system of alliances and mutual obligations. These collaborative military efforts, sanctioned by papal authority as crusades against pagan peoples, provided legitimate outlets for martial traditions, while advancing the political and commercial interests of the participating kingdoms. Development of stone architecture throughout Scandinavia during the 12th and 13th centuries provided visible evidence of this transformation from a mobile, raid-based culture to settled territorial kingdoms. The great stone churches and royal residences built during this period required enormous investments of resources and represented long-term commitments to specific locations that would have been impossible during the earlier age of seasonal raiding. And political instability. The cathedral at Lund, constructed beginning in 1103, exemplified this new architectural ambition. Built in the Romanesque style, with clear influences from German and French models, the cathedral announced Denmark's integration into European Christendom while demonstrating the wealth and stability that made such monumental projects possible. Similar developments occurred throughout Scandinavia as rulers competed to build increasingly impressive stone structures that would demonstrate their kingdom's prosperity and permanence. The emergence of written law codes during this period represented another crucial aspect of the transformation from Viking Age to medieval Scandinavian civilization. The Law of Jutland, promulgated by Valdemar II in 1241, systematically codified legal practices that had previously been maintained through oral tradition, creating standardized procedures that could be applied consistently throughout the Danish kingdom. These law codes reflected the influence of both indigenous Scandinavian legal traditions and Roman law principles absorbed through contact with European academic institutions. The result was a distinctive legal system that preserved traditional concepts like the thing assembly and trial by ordeal, while incorporating newer ideas about royal authority, written documentation, and professional legal expertise. The cultural synthesis evident in these legal developments extended to other areas of intellectual and artistic life as well. The great vernacular literature of medieval Scandinavia, including the Icelandic sagas, Danish chronicles, and Swedish legal texts, combined traditional oral storytelling techniques with literary models derived from European monastic schools and universities. Sax. O Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, completed around 1208, represented the most ambitious attempt to create a comprehensive history of the Danish people that would rival the great chronicles of other European kingdoms. Saxo's work combined legendary material preserved in oral tradition with contemporary historical events, creating a narrative that both celebrated Danish achievements and demonstrated the kingdom's rightful place within European civilization. The economic foundations of these new Scandinavian kingdoms differed dramatically from those that had supported Viking Age raiding culture. Rather than depending on wealth extracted from foreign territories, the medieval kingdoms developed internal resources through improved agricultural techniques, expanded trade networks, and the exploitation of natural resources like iron ore, timber, and fish. The rise of the Hanseatic League during the 13th century created new opportunities for Scandinavian merchants while also presenting challenges to traditional political authorities. The League's network of trading cities, extending from Novgorod to London and dominated by German merchants, offered Scandinavian producers access to international markets, but required acceptance of commercial practices and legal systems that sometimes conflicted with traditional customs. Bergen's relationship with the Hanseatic League illustrated both the benefits and costs of this commercial integration. The League's establishment of a permanent trading station at Bergen provided Norwegian fish exporters with access to profitable European markets. But German merchants gradually gained control over much of the city's commerce and wielded influence that sometimes challenged royal authority. The environmental factors that had originally contributed to Viking expansion continued to shape Scandinavian development during the medieval period, though in different ways. The medieval warm period, which had facilitated the original Viking voyages, began to give way to cooler conditions during the 13th century, affecting agricultural productivity and making some of the more marginal settlements established during the expansion period increasingly difficult to maintain. The gradual abandonment of the Greenland colonies during the 14th and 15th centuries reflected these climatic changes, as well as the declining viability of the Atlantic trade routes that had originally sustained them. The last recorded contact between Greenland and Europe occurred in 1408, and archaeological evidence suggests that the final Norse inhabitants of Greenland died out sometime during the 15th century, victims of climate change, isolation, and perhaps conflict with Inuit populations, expanding southward as conditions deteriorated. The fate of the Greenland colonies serves as a poignant reminder of the environmental constraints that had always shaped Scandinavian expansion, even during the most successful periods of Viking achievement. The deteriorating climate of the late medieval period, combined with the political and economic changes that reduced European interest in Arctic products, gradually severed the connections that had sustained these remote outposts of Scandinavian civilization for over 4 centuries. Yet even as some of the most ambitious Viking settlements were being abandoned, the cultural and genetic legacy of Scandinavian expansion was becoming permanently embedded in the populations and institutions of regions throughout the North Atlantic world. The distinctive place names that dot the landscape of northern England, Scotland, Ireland, and the Atlantic Islands preserve linguistic evidence of Viking settlement that has survived for over a millennium. In Yorkshire alone, over 600 place names derived from Old Norse, including not only obvious Viking foundations like York, from Jorvik, but also hundreds of smaller settlements whose names ending in by, Thorpe, and Thuit reveal the extent of Scandinavian agricultural settlement. These linguistic survivals represent far more than mere historical curiosities. They document the fundamental transformation of the English landscape through the introduction of Scandinavian farming techniques, settlement patterns, and social organization. The legal systems of medieval England similarly preserved important elements of Scandinavian jurisprudence long after the political independence of the Danelaw had ended. The concept of the jury trial, unknown in Anglo-Saxon law but fundamental to Norse legal procedure, became a cornerstone of English common law and eventually influenced legal development throughout the English-speaking world. The Scandinavian emphasis on written legal procedures and standardized punishments provided important precedents for the systematic law codes that emerged in medieval England. The commercial innovations introduced by Viking traders similarly had lasting impacts that extended far beyond the immediate period of Scandinavian dominance. The silver-based monetary system that developed in Viking Age England, influenced by the enormous quantities of Islamic dirhams circulating through Scandinavian trade networks, provided a foundation for the sophisticated commercial economy that would make medieval England one of Europe's wealthiest kingdoms. Archaeological investigations of Viking Age trading centers have revealed evidence for manufacturing techniques and commercial practices that were centuries ahead of their time. The glass bead production workshops discovered at sites like Ribe in Denmark employed technologies that would not become common elsewhere in Europe until the High Middle Ages, while the standardized weights and measures found throughout the Scandinavian world indicate levels of commercial sophistication that rivaled contemporary Byzantine and Islamic trading systems. The artistic and cultural influences of Viking expansion proved equally enduring, though often in forms that transformed traditional Scandinavian motifs through contact with other cultural traditions. The distinctive stone crosses of northern England and the Isle of Man combined Christian religious symbolism with traditional Norse mythological scenes, creating hybrid artistic forms that influenced European decorative arts for centuries. Famous Gosforth Cross in Cumbria, dating to the 10th century, depicts scenes from both Christian scripture and Norse mythology, including what appears to be a representation of Ragnarok alongside traditional Christian resurrection imagery. These syncretic monuments demonstrate how Viking settlers adapted their cultural traditions to new religious requirements while maintaining connections to their ancestral heritage. The influence of Scandinavian literary traditions on medieval European literature was particularly significant, though often indirect and difficult to trace with precision. The complex narrative techniques developed in the Icelandic sagas, including sophisticated character development, realistic dialogue, and psychologically convincing motivation, influenced literary development throughout Northern Europe and may have contributed to the emergence of the novel as a literary form. The preservation of pre-Christian Germanic mythology in Scandinavian sources provided medieval and later European writers with a rich source of themes and imagery that contrasted dramatically with classical Mediterranean traditions. The influence of Norse mythological concepts can be traced in works ranging from Beowulf to Wagner's Ring Cycle, demonstrating the enduring appeal of Scandinavian storytelling traditions. The political institutions developed during the Viking Age similarly provided important precedents for later European constitutional development. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930 CE, created a model of parliamentary government that influenced political development throughout Scandinavia and beyond. The concept of a legislative assembly with representatives from throughout the territory, combined with judicial functions and the authority to make binding collective decisions, provided an alternative to pure monarchy that would become increasingly important during the later medieval period. The transformation of Viking Age military brotherhoods into the knightly orders of medieval Europe represents another important continuity that is often overlooked in traditional historical narratives. The social bonds created through shared military service, the emphasis on honor and loyalty to comrades, and the ceremonial aspects of warrior culture provided important precedents for the chivalric ideals that would dominate European aristocratic culture for centuries. The Varangian Guard's evolution from a Scandinavian warrior band into a multi-ethnic military elite demonstrates how Viking Age institutions could adapt to serve very different political and cultural requirements. The Guard's ceremonial role in Byzantine court life, combined with their reputation for absolute loyalty to the emperor, created a model of military service that influenced the development of similar elite units throughout medieval Europe. Environmental knowledge accumulated through Viking exploration and settlement similarly provided important foundations for later European maritime expansion. The sailing directions preserved in Icelandic sources, including detailed descriptions of ocean currents, weather patterns, and celestial navigation techniques, represented some of the most sophisticated geographical knowledge available in medieval Europe. The Viking discovery of North America, though it failed to result in permanent European settlement, provided important precedents for later transatlantic exploration. The recognition that habitable lands existed beyond the Western Ocean challenged medieval geographical assumptions and may have influenced the theoretical frameworks that guided later explorers like Columbus, who possessed detailed knowledge of Icelandic geographical literature. The agricultural innovations developed by Viking settlers in marginal environments like Iceland and Greenland created techniques that would prove crucial for European expansion into similar climatic zones. During the early modern period, the adaptation of Scandinavian farming methods to Atlantic island conditions provided models for colonial agriculture that were later applied in regions like the Faroe Islands, Shetlands, and eventually North America. The decline of traditional Viking culture during the 13th and 14th centuries coincided with, and partially caused, fundamental changes in European military technology and political organization. The development of more effective siege techniques, the increasing importance of heavy cavalry, and the rise of professional armies reduced the military advantages that had made Viking raids so successful during the 9th and 10th centuries. Yet, even as the military aspects of Viking culture became obsolete, other elements of Scandinavian civilization continued to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. The commercial networks established by Viking traders provided foundations for the Hanseatic League and other medieval trading associations, while the political institutions developed in Viking Age kingdoms influenced the emergence of more sophisticated forms of medieval monarchy The gradual integration of Scandinavian societies into European Christendom represented both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of the distinctive pagan warrior culture that had dominated the Viking Age, but also the foundation of new forms of cultural and political development that would shape European civilization for centuries to come. The crystallization of medieval Scandinavian identity during the 13th and 14th centuries created new forms of cultural expression that both preserved and transformed Viking Age heritage. The great stone cathedrals that rose in cities like Uppsala, Trondheim, and Roskilde served not only as centers of Christian worship, but as repositories of cultural memory, where traditional Scandinavian craftsmanship techniques were applied. To new religious purposes, the magnificent wooden stave churches of Norway, with their soaring dragon-head gables and intricate carved decorations, represent perhaps the most successful fusion of pre-Christian artistic traditions with Christian architectural requirements. These remarkable structures, of which only 28 survive today from an original population of over 1,000, demonstrate how Viking Age woodworking skills were channeled into creating some of medieval Europe's most distinctive religious architecture. The Borgen Stave Church, constructed around 1180, exemplifies this architectural synthesis. Its multi-tiered roof system, supported by an ingenious framework of interlocking timber components, employs construction techniques that can be traced directly back to Viking Age shipbuilding methods. The carved decorations that adorn its portals and gables include both Christian symbols and traditional Norse motifs, creating a visual program that speaks to the complex process of religious and cultural transformation. The development of royal power during the High Middle Ages created new contexts for commemorating and reinterpreting Viking Age achievements. The great chronicle projects undertaken by medieval Scandinavian rulers serve both to legitimize contemporary political arrangements and to preserve historical memories that might otherwise have been lost to oral tradition's gradual erosion. The Danish chronicles of Saxo Grammaticus and Sven Agesen, the Norwegian king's sagas compiled by Snorri Sturluson, and the Swedish Rond Chronicle, attributed to Duke Erik, represent sophisticated attempts to create coherent national narratives. From the fragmentary materials preserved in oral tradition, family genealogies, and earlier written sources, these works established the literary foundations for Scandinavian national identity that would persist through centuries of political change. Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, completed around 1230, remains one of medieval Europe's most remarkable historical achievements. His systematic attempt to trace Norwegian royal history from legendary origins through contemporary events created a narrative framework that combined rigorous attention to chronological detail with sophisticated character analysis and political insight. The work's influence on later understanding of Viking Age history cannot be overstated, as it preserved detailed accounts of events and personalities that would otherwise be known only through fragmentary archaeological evidence. The political consolidation of the Kalmar Union in 1397 represented the most ambitious attempt to recreate the unity that had characterized Canute's North Sea Empire, though through diplomatic rather than military means. The union of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under Queen Margaret I demonstrated how Scandinavian rulers had learned to pursue territorial expansion through dynastic marriage and legal claim rather than conquest and plunder. Yet the Kalmar Union also revealed the persistent tensions between centralized authority and local autonomy that had characterized Scandinavian political culture since the Viking Age. The resistance that Swedish nobles mounted against Danish hegemony, culminating in the rebellion led by Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson in 1434, reflected enduring traditions of political independence that could be traced back to the Thing assemblies of the Viking Age. The gradual development of more sophisticated administrative systems during the late medieval period created new opportunities for documenting and preserving historical knowledge. Royal chanceries, episcopal archives, and municipal record-keeping systems generated vast quantities of written documentation that provide detailed insights into social, economic, and cultural developments that had previously been recorded only through archaeological evidence. The Swedish provincial laws, codified during the 13th and 14th centuries, preserve legal traditions that demonstrate remarkable continuity with Viking Age practices while adapting to medieval European legal norms. The Västerland law's provisions regarding inheritance, property rights, and criminal justice reveal how traditional Scandinavian concepts of social obligation were modified to accommodate Christian moral teachings and royal administrative requirements. The economic transformation of medieval Scandinavia created new forms of wealth that supported cultural achievements rivaling those of any European region. The expansion of iron production in Sweden, the development of Norway's timber and fish exports, and Denmark's emergence as a major grain producer generated resources that enabled ambitious architectural projects, extensive manuscript production, and sophisticated artistic patronage. The great copper mines of Fylun, first documented in the 13th century, but probably exploited much earlier, became one of Europe's most important sources of copper and provided Sweden with the economic foundation for its later emergence as a major European power. The mining techniques developed at Fylun, combined with innovations in metallurgy and smelting, represented technological achievements that built directly upon the metalworking skills that had made Viking Age weapons and tools renowned throughout Europe. The cultural achievements of medieval Scandinavia extended beyond preservation and adaptation of Viking Age heritage to include significant innovations in literature, art, and scholarship. The development of vernacular poetry traditions, exemplified by works like the Danish folk ballads and the Swedish Euphemius, created new forms of literary expression that combined traditional Germanic alliterative verse with influences from continental European poetry. The emergence of urban cultural centers during this period provided new contexts for artistic and intellectual development. Stockholm's rise as a cultural as well as political capital attracted artists, scholars, and craftsmen from throughout Northern Europe, creating a cosmopolitan environment that fostered innovation while maintaining connections to traditional Scandinavian culture. The famous Stockholm bloodbath of 1520, while primarily a political event, also represented the culmination of cultural tensions between local Scandinavian traditions and external influences. The systematic execution of Swedish nobility by Danish King Christian II reflected not only political calculation, but also deeper conflicts about cultural identity and political autonomy that had roots extending back to the Viking Age. The Protestant Reformation's arrival in Scandinavia during the 16th century created new opportunities for cultural expression while simultaneously threatening the preservation of medieval manuscripts and artistic works associated with Catholic religious practices. The translation of the Bible into vernacular Scandinavian languages stimulated literacy development and provided new contexts for celebrating distinctive national cultural traditions. Gustav Vasa's break with Rome in 1523 not only established Swedish political independence, but also created the foundation for a distinctive Protestant culture that would profoundly influence Scandinavian intellectual development. The emphasis on vernacular religious literature, combined with the confiscation of Catholic church properties, redirected cultural patronage toward secular purposes while preserving important elements of traditional Scandinavian heritage. Renaissance discovery of Iceland's remarkable literary heritage provided European scholars with their first systematic access to authentic Viking Age cultural materials. The collection and publication of Icelandic sagas and Eddic poetry during the 17th and 18th centuries created new opportunities for understanding pre-Christian Scandinavian culture and stimulated romantic interest in Viking heritage that would influence European cultural development for centuries. The scholarly work of figures like Ole Worm in Denmark and Johannes Scheffer in Sweden established the foundations for systematic study of Scandinavian antiquities and created methodological approaches to historical research that combine documentary analysis with archaeological investigation. Their efforts to preserve and interpret runestones, burial sites, and traditional cultural practices provided crucial documentation of Viking Age heritage during a period when much physical evidence was being destroyed through agricultural and urban development. The emergence of national romantic movements during the 19th century created new contexts for commemorating and celebrating Viking heritage, though often in forms that owed more to contemporary political and cultural concerns and to historical accuracy. The rediscovery of Viking Age literature and archaeology provided raw materials for constructing national mythologies that served the political requirements of emerging nation-states while satisfying romantic longings for heroic ancestors and distinctive cultural traditions. The systematic archaeological investigation of Viking Age sites that began during the 19th century revolutionized understanding of Scandinavian medieval culture and provided concrete evidence for historical developments that had previously been known only through literary sources of questionable reliability. The excavation of the Oseberg ship burial in 1904 provided the first comprehensive view of the material culture that had surrounded Viking Age elites, revealing levels of artistic sophistication and technological innovation that challenged prevailing assumptions about medieval Scandinavian civilization. The Oseberg burial, dating to approximately 834 CE, contained not only the remarkably preserved remains of a magnificent longship, but also an extraordinary collection of textiles, wooden artifacts, and metalwork that demonstrated the cosmopolitan character of Viking Age culture. The ship itself, with its elegant lines and intricate carved decorations, represented the pinnacle of Scandinavian shipbuilding achievement, while the grave goods revealed trade connections extending from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The discovery of similar ship burials at Gokstad in 1880 and Tuam in 1867 provided additional evidence for the central role that maritime technology played in Viking Age society. These vessels, preserved through the unique chemical conditions of their burial environments, allowed modern researchers to understand exactly how Viking ships were constructed and to appreciate the engineering innovations that had made long-distance voyaging possible with 9th century technology. The experimental archaeology projects that followed these discoveries, including the construction and sailing of replica Viking ships, demonstrated that the literary accounts of remarkable voyages preserved in saga literature were not only possible, but represented routine achievements for experienced Scandinavian mariners. The successful crossing of the Atlantic by the replica ship Islandingur in 2000, following routes described in medieval Icelandic sources, provided dramatic confirmation of Viking navigational capabilities. The development of more sophisticated archaeological techniques during the 20th century enabled researchers to investigate aspects of Viking Age society that had previously been invisible to historical inquiry. The analysis of skeletal remains from Viking Age cemeteries revealed information about health, nutrition, life expectancy, and population demographics that provided crucial context for understanding the social and economic forces that had driven Scandinavian expansion. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones from Viking Age burials has revealed patterns of mobility and migration that confirm the cosmopolitan character of Scandinavian society during the expansion period. Individuals buried in Scandinavian contexts often proved to have spent significant portions of their lives in regions as distant as the British Isles, Eastern Europe, or the Mediterranean, while people of non-Scandinavian origin were frequently found in graves that followed traditional Norse burial customs. The analysis of DNA, evidence from both ancient remains and modern populations, has provided additional insights into the demographic impact of Viking expansion. These studies reveal that Scandinavian genetic markers are present throughout the regions where Vikings are known to have settled, but in patterns that suggest complex processes of cultural assimilation rather than simple population replacement. In Iceland, genetic analysis indicates that the founding population included significant numbers of people of Celtic origin, probably women captured during raids on Ireland and Scotland, who became integrated into Scandinavian families through marriage or concubinage. This evidence provides biological confirmation for the cultural synthesis that is evident in Icelandic literature and archaeological remains. The environmental archaeology of Viking Age sites has revealed crucial information about the climate, conditions, agricultural practices, and resource exploitation strategies that supported Scandinavian expansion. The analysis of pollen sequences, tree rings, and other environmental indicators confirms that the medieval warm period provided more favorable conditions for agriculture and navigation than the other periods that preceded and followed the Viking Age. Study of animal bones from Viking Age settlements has revealed the sophisticated livestock management strategies that enabled Scandinavian communities to thrive in marginal environments like Iceland and Greenland. The selective breeding programs that produced hardy cattle, sheep, and horses adapted to harsh northern conditions represented agricultural innovations that were crucial for the success of Atlantic colonization. The excavation of urban centers like York, Dublin, and Novgorod has provided detailed insights into the daily life of Viking Age communities and revealed the sophisticated commercial and manufacturing systems that supported Scandinavian expansion. These sites contain evidence for specialized craft production, long-distance trade networks, and urban planning that demonstrates levels of social organization comparable to the most advanced contemporary civilizations. The York Archaeological Trust's excavations at Coppergate, conducted between 1976 and 1981, uncovered an entire Viking Age neighborhood that had been preserved through waterlogged conditions. The site revealed workshops for metalworking, leather production, textile manufacturing, and other crafts, along with evidence for international trade connections that brought amber from the Baltic, silk from Central Asia, and cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean to this northern English city. The preservation of organic materials at waterlogged sites like York has provided unprecedented insights into Viking Age technology, including sophisticated woodworking techniques, advanced textile production methods, and metallurgical innovations that were centuries ahead of their time. The analysis of tool marks on wooden artifacts has revealed the specialized skills that Scandinavian craftsmen possessed, while the examination of textile fragments has demonstrated the high quality of fabrics produced in Viking Age workshops. Discovery of extensive Viking Age settlement remains in Greenland has provided crucial evidence for understanding how Scandinavian communities adapted to Arctic conditions and maintained connections with European civilization across thousands of miles of ocean. The excavation of farms like Garhar and Valsey has revealed sophisticated architectural adaptations to extreme climate conditions, including innovative heating systems and building techniques that maximized energy efficiency. The analysis of import materials from Greenland sites demonstrates that these remote communities maintained trade connections with Europe throughout most of their existence, receiving luxury goods like wine, metal tools, and religious artifacts in exchange for Arctic products like walrus ivory, polar bear pelts, and falcons prized by European elites. The investigation of the Norse settlement at Lanzu Meadows in Newfoundland has provided crucial insights into Viking exploration of North America and the challenges that prevented permanent European colonization during the medieval period. The site's limited size and brief occupation period confirm the saga accounts of failed attempts at permanent settlement while providing archaeological evidence for the technological capabilities that enabled these remarkable voyages. The comparative analysis of archaeological evidence from Lowndes O. Meadows with contemporary sites in Greenland and Iceland has revealed the standardized construction techniques that enabled Vikings to establish functional settlements rapidly in unfamiliar environments. The building methods employed at the Newfoundland site, including the distinctive longhouse design and specialized workshops for iron production, follow patterns that can be traced throughout the Scandinavian world, demonstrating the remarkable consistency of cultural practices across vast geographical distances. The iron-working evidence from Lowndes Meadows provides particularly compelling proof of Norse presence, as the bog iron extraction and smelting techniques employed at the site were uniquely Scandinavian technologies unknown to indigenous North American populations. The production of iron nails and other metal objects at this remote location demonstrates the technological self-sufficiency that made Viking exploration possible, while also revealing the practical limitations that ultimately made permanent settlement unsustainable. The study of climate data from ice cores and tree rings has provided crucial context for understanding both the success and ultimate failure of Viking colonization efforts in the North Atlantic. The medieval warm period that facilitated initial settlement began to give way to cooler conditions during the 13th century, creating agricultural challenges that made marginal settlements increasingly difficult to maintain. A Little Ice Age, beginning around 1300 CE, created particularly severe challenges for the Greenland colonies, shortening growing seasons and making sea ice conditions increasingly dangerous for the small boats that provided essential transportation between scattered settlements. The archaeological evidence for this environmental deterioration includes changes in house construction techniques, dietary shifts toward marine resources, and the gradual abandonment of outlying farms as communities concentrated in more defensible locations. The interaction between Norse settlers and indigenous populations represents one of the most fascinating and poorly understood aspects of Viking expansion. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the North Atlantic reveals varying patterns of contact, conflict, and cooperation that depended heavily on local circumstances and the relative population densities of the groups involved. In the Shetland and Orkney Islands, the archaeological record suggests relatively peaceful assimilation of existing Pictish populations with incoming Norse settlers. The gradual transformation of Pictish symbol stones to include Norse runic inscriptions, combined with burial practices that blend Celtic and Scandinavian traditions, indicates cultural synthesis rather than simple population replacement. The situation in Ireland proved more complex, with evidence for both violent conflict and extensive cultural exchange. The establishment of fortified Viking towns like Dublin, Cork, and Waterford created permanent Scandinavian population centers that maintained distinct cultural identities while also serving as conduits for cultural and commercial exchange with Gaelic Irish communities. The annalistic evidence from Irish monastic sources provides detailed accounts of Viking raids and their impact on Irish society. But archaeological investigations have revealed that the relationship between Vikings and Irish was far more nuanced than these hostile accounts suggest. Excavations at sites like Wood Quay in Dublin have uncovered evidence for extensive trade relationships, intermarriage, and cultural borrowing that created hybrid Irish-Norse communities with distinctive characteristics. The linguistic evidence for this cultural synthesis is particularly striking in Ireland, where hundreds of Norse loanwords entered Irish Gaelic, particularly in areas related to maritime activities, trade, and urban life. Conversely, Irish influence on Norse language and culture is evident in personal names, artistic motifs, and religious practices that appear in Scandinavian contexts throughout the medieval period. The role of slavery in Viking society represents one of the most disturbing aspects of Scandinavian expansion, yet one that was economically crucial for supporting the lifestyle and military activities that characterized the Viking Age. Archaeological evidence from trading centers throughout the Scandinavian world reveals the infrastructure that supported a massive slave trade. Connecting Northern Europe with markets in the Islamic world and Byzantium. The scale of this trade becomes apparent when we consider that contemporary Arabic sources describe Scandinavian merchants arriving in markets like Baghdad and Constantinople with hundreds of slaves captured during raids throughout Europe. The economic incentives created by this trade helped drive the raiding activities that terrorized European communities, while providing the wealth that supported Scandinavian expansion and cultural development. The treatment of slaves within Scandinavia society appears to have varied considerably, depending on their origins, skills, and the circumstances of their capture. While many captives were clearly destined for export to foreign markets, others were integrated into Scandinavian households and communities in ways that eventually led to their assimilation and freedom. The legal codes preserved in Icelandic and other Scandinavian sources reveal sophisticated regulations governing the treatment of slaves, including provisions for manumission, protection against excessive abuse, and procedures for slaves to gain their freedom through loyal service or payment. These regulations suggest that slavery, while certainly exploitative, operated within cultural and legal frameworks that recognize slaves as human beings with certain rights and protections. The religious transformation that accompanied the conversion to Christianity had profound implications for Scandinavian attitudes towards slavery and social hierarchy. Christian teaching about the spiritual equality of all human beings created theological challenges to traditional practices, though the actual abolition of slavery proceeded gradually and was often incomplete. The process of Christianization itself reveals the sophisticated diplomatic and cultural strategies that characterized late Viking Age politics. Rather than simply imposing foreign religious practices through military conquest, Scandinavian rulers carefully negotiated the terms of conversion to preserve as much as possible of traditional cultural practices while gaining access to the political and commercial advantages that came with membership in Christian Europe. The archaeological evidence for this religious transition is particularly fascinating, as it reveals gradual changes in burial practices, artistic motifs, and architectural styles that reflect the complex process of cultural adaptation. Many Scandinavian churches from the conversion period include decorative elements that clearly derive from pre-Christian artistic traditions, while Christian symbols often appear alongside traditional Norse motifs in ways that suggest syncretic religious beliefs. The famous Jelling stones in Denmark provide perhaps the most dramatic example of this religious transition. The larger stone, erected by Harald Bluetooth around 965 CE, proclaims that Harald made the Danes Christian, while also celebrating his conquest of Norway and his father Gorm's achievements. The monument's artistic program combines traditional Norse decorative motifs with Christian imagery, creating a visual representation of the cultural synthesis that characterized the conversion period. The development of distinctively Scandinavian forms of Christianity created religious traditions that maintained important connections to pre-Christian cultural practices while also facilitating integration into European Christendom. The wooden stave churches of Norway, with their distinctive architectural style and decorative programs, represent perhaps the most successful fusion of Christian religious requirements with traditional Scandinavian artistic and technological capabilities. These remarkable structures employed construction techniques that derived directly from Viking Age shipbuilding and woodworking traditions, while their decorative programs often included traditional Norse mythological motifs alongside Christian symbols. The result was a uniquely Scandinavian form of Christian architecture that influenced church design throughout Northern Europe. The preservation of pre-Christian mythological themes within Christian artistic contexts reveals the sophisticated theological negotiations that accompanied Scandinavian religious conversion. The famous portal carvings at the Heilstad Stave Church, depicting scenes from the Sigurd legend alongside Christian imagery, demonstrate how traditional heroic narratives were reinterpreted to serve Christian moral purposes while maintaining their cultural resonance for Scandinavian audiences. This process of cultural translation extended beyond visual arts to include literature, law, and social customs that were gradually modified to accommodate Christian teaching while preserving essential elements of Scandinavian identity. The result was a distinctive form of medieval Christianity that differed significantly from the religious culture that developed in other parts of Europe, creating traditions that would influence Scandinavian society for centuries to come. The economic implications of Christianization proved equally significant, as conversion opened new commercial opportunities, while also requiring substantial investments in church construction, clerical education, and religious ceremonies that redirected resources previously devoted to military activities. The establishment of episcopal sees in major Scandinavian cities created new centers of learning and cultural production that attracted scholars and artists from throughout Europe. The cathedral school at Lund, established in the late 11th century, became one of Northern Europe's most important educational institutions, producing both clerical and secular leaders who applied their learning to advance Scandinavian political and cultural development. Similar institutions at Uppsala, Trondheim, and other episcopal centers created networks of educated elites who maintained connections throughout the Scandinavian world while also participating in broader European intellectual culture. The transition from oral to written culture that accompanied Christianization had profound implications for the preservation of traditional knowledge and the development of new forms of literary expression. The adoption of Latin literacy for religious and administrative purposes created new possibilities for documenting laws, recording historical events, and preserving cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost to the gradual erosion of oral transmission. Yet this transition also created tensions between traditional and innovative approaches to cultural expression. The Christian emphasis on written authority challenged the fluid, adaptive character of oral tradition, while the use of Latin for formal purposes created barriers between learned and popular culture that had not existed in pre-Christian Scandinavian society. The development of vernacular writing systems during the 12th and 13th centuries helped resolve some of these tensions by creating new possibilities for recording traditional materials in forms that remained accessible to broader populations. The great manuscript collections preserved in Iceland, including the codices that contain the Poetic Edda and the major family sagas, represent the most successful attempts to bridge the gap between oral tradition and written literature. The scholarly achievements of figures like Snorri Sturluson demonstrate how educated Scandinavians learned to combine traditional cultural knowledge with contemporary European intellectual methods to create works of lasting significance. Snorri's Prose Edda, completed around 1220, not only preserved crucial information about pre-Christian mythology, but also provided sophisticated analysis of poetic techniques and narrative structures that influenced European literary development for centuries. The political consolidation of medieval Scandinavian kingdoms created new contexts for patronizing cultural activities, while also generating resources that supported ambitious artistic and architectural projects. The competition among royal courts for prestige and legitimacy stimulated cultural production that combined traditional Scandinavian themes with influences absorbed through diplomatic and commercial contacts throughout Europe. The remarkable wooden sculptures preserved in Norwegian stave churches represent one of the highest achievements of medieval Scandinavian art, combining sophisticated carving techniques with iconographic programs that blend Christian and traditional motifs in ways that created distinctively Northern European artistic traditions. The dragon head carvings that adorn many of these structures clearly derive from pre-Christian artistic traditions, yet they are integrated into Christian architectural contexts that transform their symbolic meaning. The development of stone sculpture. During this period, similarly demonstrates the creative synthesis that characterized late medieval Scandinavian culture. The baptismal fonts, carved by Master Majestadus in Gotland during the 12th century, combine Scandinavian decorative traditions with Romanesque artistic influences to create works that are simultaneously distinctively regional and thoroughly European in their cultural references. The gradual integration of Scandinavian societies into European political and cultural systems created new opportunities for influence and exchange, while also presenting challenges to traditional forms of social organization and cultural expression. The adoption of feudal political structures, though never as complete in Scandinavia as in other parts of Europe, introduced new concepts of social hierarchy and political obligation that modified traditional relationships between rulers and subjects. The emergence of powerful noble families during the 13th and 14th centuries created new forms of cultural patronage that supported artistic and literary activities while also generating political tensions that would ultimately contribute to the dissolution of medieval Scandinavian unity. The rise of families like the Folkunga in Sweden and the various noble lineages that competed for influence in Denmark and Norway created court cultures that rivaled those of other European kingdoms while maintaining distinctively Scandinavian characteristics. The architectural evidence for this cultural sophistication is visible in the great stone castles and manor houses that were constructed throughout Scandinavia during the High Middle Ages. Structures like Kalmar Castle in Sweden and Akershus Fortress in Norway demonstrate how Scandinavian builders adapted European military architecture to local conditions while creating distinctive regional variations that reflected both practical requirements and cultural preferences. The development of urban culture during this period created new contexts for cultural expression and commercial activity that attracted populations from throughout Northern Europe. Cities like Stockholm, Bergen, and Copenhagen evolved from relatively simple trading posts into sophisticated urban centers with specialized craft districts, permanent merchant communities, and cultural institutions that supported artistic and intellectual activities. The guilds that organized urban craftsmen during this period preserved and transmitted technical knowledge while also serving as social institutions that maintained community solidarity and cultural traditions. The guild regulations preserved in medieval Scandinavian archives reveal sophisticated organizational structures that balanced economic competition with cooperative obligations, creating systems that supported both individual achievement and collective welfare. The international character of these urban communities is evident in archaeological remains that reveal the presence of German merchants, Flemish craftsmen, English traders, and artisans from throughout Europe who contributed their skills to Scandinavian cultural and economic development. This cosmopolitan character created opportunities for cultural exchange, while also presenting challenges to traditional forms of social organization and cultural identity. The role of women in these urban communities appears to have been particularly significant, with documentary evidence revealing female participation in commercial activities, craft production, and cultural patronage that exceeded the opportunities available to women in most contemporary European societies. The famous Margaret Skelesdatter, who controlled extensive commercial operations in 14th century Bergen, exemplifies the economic authority that some Scandinavian women were able to achieve within these urban contexts. The documentary evidence for female economic authority in medieval Scandinavian cities reflects broader patterns of social organization that preserved important elements of the gender equality that had characterized Viking Age society. Legal codes from this period continue to recognize women's rights to own property independently, engage in commercial transactions, and participate in legal proceedings in ways that distinguish Scandinavian law from the more restrictive legal traditions that governed women's status in other parts of medieval Europe. The preservation of these legal traditions through the medieval period created foundations for the relatively egalitarian social structures that would later characterize modern Scandinavian societies. The concept of individual rights balanced against collective obligations, which had emerged during the Viking Age through institutions like the Thing Assembly, evolved during the medieval period into more sophisticated forms of constitutional government that influenced European political development for centuries. The cultural memory of Viking Age achievements provided medieval Scandinavian societies with powerful symbols of national identity and historical legitimacy that could be deployed to support contemporary political ambitions. The saga literature that celebrated the deeds of legendary heroes like Ragnar Lothbrok, Harald Hardrada, and Eric the Red created cultural narratives that linked medieval kingdoms to glorious ancestral traditions, while also providing models of leadership and heroic behavior. Yet this process of cultural commemoration also involved significant reinterpretation and idealization of Viking Age realities. The medieval chroniclers who preserved these traditions were writing for Christian audiences with very different values and concerns than those that had motivated their pagan ancestors, creating literary works that often emphasized moral lessons and political allegories rather than historical accuracy. The transformation of legendary Viking figures into literary characters, suitable for medieval audiences, reveals the complex process through which cultural memory adapts to serve contemporary needs while preserving essential elements of historical identity. The Ragnar Lothbrok of the medieval sagas, for example, bears little resemblance to any historical individual, yet he served important cultural functions as a symbol of Scandinavian martial prowess and political independence. The archaeological investigation of sites associated with these legendary figures has provided fascinating insights into how historical memory was constructed and maintained in medieval Scandinavian societies. The great burial mounds at Gamla Uppsala in Sweden, traditionally associated with legendary kings like Aun and Egil, contain archaeological evidence that confirms the existence of wealthy and powerful rulers during the migration period, though probably not the specific individuals celebrated in later literature. The persistence of pagan religious practices and beliefs, long after official Christianization, created syncretic cultural forms that preserved essential elements of pre-Christian worldview within ostensibly Christian contexts. The celebration of seasonal festivals, the veneration of sacred groves in springs, and the performance of traditional rituals continued throughout the medieval period, often incorporated into Christian ceremonial cycles in ways that satisfied both religious authorities and popular cultural requirements. The famous medieval Scandinavian ballads that preserve stories of trolls, elves, and other supernatural beings represent one of the most successful adaptations of pre-Christian mythology to Christian cultural contexts. These narratives, performed at seasonal celebrations and social gatherings, maintained connections to ancient cosmological beliefs, while also serving as entertainment and moral instruction for medieval audiences. The linguistic evidence for this cultural continuity is particularly striking, as Old Norse terminology for supernatural beings, natural phenomena, and social relationships continued to be used throughout the medieval period, even as Latin became the language of formal religious and administrative discourse. This linguistic persistence ensured that traditional ways of understanding and describing the world remained available to medieval Scandinavians even as their formal religious and political institutions were transformed. The influence of Scandinavian legal traditions on European jurisprudence extended far beyond the immediate regions of Viking settlement to affect the development of legal concepts and procedures throughout Northern Europe. The Germanic legal principle of individual compensation rather than collective punishment, which had been refined in Scandinavian legal traditions, influenced the development of medieval European law codes that emphasized restitution and rehabilitation over simple retribution. the concept of trial by jury, which developed from traditional Scandinavian legal practices involving community participation in judicial decisions, became one of the most important contributions of Viking Age political culture to European civilization. This legal innovation, transmitted through the hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian legal system that emerged in medieval England, eventually influenced legal development throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. The commercial innovations developed during the Viking Age similarly had lasting impacts on European economic development that extended far beyond the immediate period of Scandinavian expansion. The credit instruments, standardized weights and measures, and commercial law procedures that evolved to support long-distance Viking trade provided important precedents for the more sophisticated commercial systems that emerged during the High Middle Ages. The Hanseatic League, which dominated Baltic and North Sea commerce from the 13th through 15th centuries, built directly upon the trading networks and commercial practices that had been established by Viking merchants centuries earlier. The League's system of trading privileges, standardized commercial procedures, and dispute resolution mechanisms reflected legal and commercial innovations that could be traced back to Viking Age precedents. The gradual decline of specifically Scandinavian influence in European affairs during the later medieval period coincided with the emergence of more centralized European monarchies that possessed the resources and organizational capabilities to resist external conquest while also participating in increasingly sophisticated diplomatic and commercial relationships. The age when small Viking fleets could terrorize entire kingdoms had ended, replaced by an international system based on negotiated agreements and mutual obligations. Yet the cultural achievements of the Viking Age continued to influence European development through their preservation in literature, law, and artistic traditions that maintained their vitality long after the political circumstances that had created them had disappeared. The values of individual achievement, democratic participation, and cultural independence that had characterized Viking Age society continued to influence Scandinavian political development and would eventually contribute to the distinctive forms of social democracy that emerged in modern Nordic countries. The environmental knowledge accumulated through Viking exploration and settlement similarly provided important foundations for later European maritime expansion and colonial development. The practical skills of oceanic navigation, the understanding of climate patterns and seasonal variations, and the techniques for establishing settlements in marginal environments would prove crucial for European expansion into similar geographical regions during the early modern period. The legacy of Viking Age technological innovation remained visible throughout the medieval period in the sophisticated metalworking, woodworking, and textile production capabilities that made Scandinavian products highly valued in international markets. The quality of Scandinavian iron, the durability of Nordic wooden structures, and the beauty of traditional textiles created commercial advantages that supported continued economic prosperity long after military conquest was no longer a viable source of wealth. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical antiquity created new contexts for appreciating Scandinavian cultural achievements, while also stimulating scholarly interest in the manuscript traditions that had preserved Viking Age literature and historical materials. The humanist emphasis on recovering authentic ancient texts led to systematic efforts to collect, edit, and publish the remarkable literary heritage that had been maintained in Icelandic monasteries and noble libraries throughout the medieval period. The Danish scholar Ole Worm, working during the early 17th century, pioneered the systematic study of runic inscriptions and archaeological monuments that provided direct evidence for Viking Age culture independent of later literary sources. His careful documentation of runestones, burial mounds, and other archaeological remains established methodological standards for antiquarian research that influenced scholarly investigation throughout Northern Europe. Worm's recognition that runic inscriptions represented an authentic ancient Scandinavian writing system rather than mere magical symbols marked a crucial breakthrough in understanding Viking Age culture. His patient work in deciphering runic texts revealed that these inscriptions documented ordinary aspects of daily life, including commercial transactions, family relationships, and travel accounts that provided invaluable insights into social practices that were rarely mentioned in formal historical sources. The publication of Icelandic sagas during the 17th and 18th centuries introduced European readers to one of medieval literature's greatest achievements, while also providing unprecedented access to authentic Viking Age cultural materials. The complex narrative techniques, sophisticated character development, and realistic social detail found in works like Njál's Saga and Egil's Saga demonstrated that Scandinavian literary culture had achieved levels of artistic sophistication that rivaled the classical traditions that dominated Renaissance education. The scholarly editing projects undertaken by figures like Arne Magnusson in Iceland and Petter Hansen Racen in Denmark represented heroic efforts to preserve literary materials that were rapidly deteriorating through neglect and environmental damage. The Great Fire that destroyed much of Copenhagen in 1728, including significant portions of Magnusson's manuscript collection, demonstrated the fragility of these irreplaceable cultural resources, while also highlighting the dedication of scholars who risked their lives to preserve them. The emergence of comparative philology during the 18th century created new possibilities for understanding the relationships among different Germanic languages and cultures, revealing the fundamental unity that underlay the apparent diversity of European linguistic and cultural traditions. The recognition that Old Norse shared common origins with other Germanic languages provided crucial evidence for understanding the prehistoric migrations and cultural developments that had shaped European civilization. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries discovered in Viking Age literature and culture powerful symbols of natural freedom, heroic individualism, and authentic cultural expression that contrasted dramatically with what Romantics saw as the artificial conventions of contemporary European civilization. The translation of Icelandic sagas into major European languages introduced broader audiences to stories of adventure, exploration, and heroic achievement that captured the Romantic imagination. The influence of Viking themes on Romantic literature extended from the sublime nature poetry of the Scandinavian countries to the historical novels of Sir Walter Scott and the mythological dramas of Richard Wagner. The image of the Viking warrior, simplified and idealized through Romantic interpretation, became one of the most powerful symbols of masculine heroism and cultural authenticity in 19th century European culture. Yet this Romantic celebration of Viking achievement also involved significant distortion of historical realities, as writers and artists selectively emphasized aspects of Scandinavian culture that supported contemporary political and cultural agendas while ignoring elements that contradicted Romantic idealizations. The result was a mythologized vision of Viking civilization that owed as much to 19th century cultural concerns as to authentic historical evidence. The development of scientific archaeology during the 19th century provided new methods for investigating Viking Age culture that could supplement and sometimes correct the literary sources that had previously provided the primary evidence for understanding Scandinavian medieval civilization. The systematic excavation of burial sites, settlement remains, and artifact deposits revealed aspects of daily life, social organization, and technological capability that were rarely mentioned in written sources. The discovery of the Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials provided spectacular confirmation of saga accounts describing the elaborate funeral ceremonies that had honored Viking Age elites while also revealing the sophisticated craftsmanship and international trade connections that had supported Scandinavian material culture. These finds demonstrated that archaeological evidence could provide insights into Viking civilization that were both more reliable and more comprehensive than those available through literary sources alone, not the establishment of national museums. In Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Oslo during the 19th century created institutional frameworks for preserving and displaying Viking Age artifacts while also supporting the scholarly research that would transform understanding of Scandinavian medieval culture. These institutions, supported by growing national pride and international scholarly interest, sponsored excavation projects and publication efforts that established Scandinavian archaeology as one of Europe's most advanced and productive scholarly enterprises. The political implications of Viking Age studies during the 19th and early 20th centuries reflected the broader nationalist movements that were reshaping European political and cultural landscapes. The rediscovery of Viking achievements provided newly independent or aspiring Scandinavian nations with powerful symbols of historical greatness and cultural distinctiveness that could support claims for political autonomy and international recognition. The celebration of Viking heritage in popular culture during this period created traditions and symbols that would influence Scandinavian national identity for generations. The adoption of Viking imagery for national symbols, the naming of streets and institutions after legendary heroes, and the incorporation of Old Norse themes into educational curricula created cultural frameworks that linked contemporary Scandinavian societies to their medieval ancestors. Yet this nationalist appropriation of Viking heritage also created problematic associations between Scandinavian culture and racial superiority theories that would have tragic consequences during the 20th century. The transformation of Viking warriors into symbols of Germanic racial excellence provided ideological support for political movements that perverted scholarly appreciation of Scandinavian cultural achievements into justifications for aggression and persecution. The development of more rigorous archaeological and historical methodologies during the 20th century enabled scholars to separate authentic Viking Age achievements from the mythological distortions that had accumulated through centuries of political and cultural manipulation. This scholarly maturation created possibilities for understanding Scandinavian medieval culture as a complex historical phenomenon worthy of study for its own achievements rather than as a source of symbols to support contemporary political agendas. The revolutionary advances in scientific dating techniques during the mid-20th century, particularly the development of radiocarbon dating by Willard Libby, transformed Viking Age studies by providing precise chronological frameworks for archaeological discoveries that had previously been dated only through stylistic analysis and stratigraphic relationships. This technological breakthrough enabled scholars to correlate archaeological evidence with historical events documented in written sources, creating much more accurate reconstructions of Viking Age chronology and cultural development. The application of these new dating methods to key Viking Age sites revealed that many developments had occurred earlier than previously believed, while also demonstrating the remarkable speed with which Scandinavian culture had evolved during the expansion period. The discovery that the earliest Viking raids had begun several decades before the famous attack on Lindisfarne in 793 CE, for example, provided new insights into the gradual development of the raiding culture that would transform European history. Interdisciplinary approach that emerged in Viking Age studies during the later 20th century brought together archaeologists, historians, linguists, climatologists, and specialists from numerous other fields to create comprehensive understanding of Scandinavian medieval culture that transcended the limitations of any single scholarly discipline. This collaborative methodology enabled researchers to address complex questions about social organization, economic systems, and cultural change that required evidence from multiple sources and analytical techniques. The development of underwater Archaeology opened entirely new categories of Viking Age evidence through the systematic investigation of shipwrecks, harbor installations, and submerged settlements that had been inaccessible to earlier generations of researchers. The discovery of multiple Viking Age wrecks in Danish waters provided unprecedented opportunities to study ship construction techniques, cargo contents, and navigation equipment that revealed new aspects of Scandinavian maritime culture. The Skolteliv. Ships, discovered in Roskilde Fjord during the 1960s, provided the most comprehensive evidence available for understanding the full range of vessel types employed by Viking Age Scandinavians. The 5 ships found at this site included both military vessels designed for raiding and warfare and merchant ships optimized for cargo transport, demonstrating the sophisticated specialization that had developed within Scandinavian shipbuilding. Traditions. Experimental archaeology projects based on these discoveries enabled researchers to test theories about Viking Age navigation techniques, sailing performance, and the practical challenges of long-distance voyaging with medieval technology. The successful recreation of Viking voyages to North America using replica ships built with authentic techniques and materials provided dramatic confirmation that the saga accounts of transatlantic exploration represented genuine historical achievements. Rather than legendary embellishments, the analysis of wood samples from Viking Age ships using dendrochronological techniques revealed precise information about when and where these vessels had been constructed, while also providing insights into the forest management practices and timber trade networks that had supplied Scandinavian shipbuilders. This research demonstrated that Viking Age communities possessed sophisticated understanding of wood properties and seasoning techniques that enabled them to construct vessels capable of surviving the extreme stresses of ocean voyaging. The investigation of Viking Age diet and health through the analysis of human remains revealed that Scandinavian populations during the expansion period enjoyed relatively good nutrition and health compared to many contemporary European societies. The skeletal evidence indicates that Vikings were generally taller and more robust than their contemporaries, with dental health that suggests access to diverse and nutritious food sources. Isotopic analysis of bone and teeth from Viking Age burials has provided remarkable insights into individual life histories, revealing patterns of mobility and migration that confirm the cosmopolitan character of Scandinavian society. These studies have shown that many individuals buried in traditional Viking graves had spent significant portions of their lives in distant regions, while people of non-Scandinavian origin were frequently integrated into Scandinavian communities and buried according to Norse customs. The study of ancient DNA extracted from Viking Age remains has revolutionized understanding of Scandinavian population genetics and migration patterns. These analyses have revealed that Viking Age society was far more ethnically diverse than previously imagined, with significant populations of people of Celtic, Slavic, and other non-Germanic origins living within Scandinavian communities and participating fully in Viking culture. The genetic evidence has also provided new insights into the demographic impact of Viking expansion on the populations of settled regions. In Iceland, DNA analysis confirms that the founding population included substantial numbers of people of Celtic origin, probably women captured during raids who became integrated into Scandinavian families. In other regions, the genetic legacy of Viking settlement varies considerably depending on local circumstances and the nature of the colonization process. The environmental archaeology of Viking Age sites has revealed crucial information about the climate conditions, agricultural practices, and ecological impacts that shaped Scandinavian expansion and settlement. Pollen analysis from sites throughout the North Atlantic has confirmed that the medieval warm period provided more favorable conditions for agriculture and navigation than the periods that preceded and followed the Viking Age, enabling expansion. into marginal regions that would later become uninhabitable. The study of animal bones from Viking Age settlements has provided detailed information about livestock management practices, hunting strategies, and dietary preferences that varied considerably across different regions and social classes. The analysis of fish bones from coastal sites reveals the sophisticated maritime subsistence strategies that supported permanent settlement in regions like Iceland and Greenland, while the examination of cattle and sheep documents the agricultural innovations that enabled Scandinavian communities to thrive in challenging environments. The investigation of Viking Age trade networks through the analysis of artifact distributions, raw material sources, and manufacturing techniques has revealed the truly global scope of Scandinavian commercial activities. The presence of silk from China, spices from India, silver from Central Asia, and amber from the Baltic in excavations throughout the Viking world demonstrates the remarkable extent of the commercial networks that connected Scandinavia with distant civilizations. The development of more sophisticated analytical techniques for studying metalwork has provided new insights into Viking Age technological capabilities and craft specialization. X-ray analysis and metallographic examination of weapons, tools, and jewelry have revealed manufacturing techniques that were often centuries ahead of their time, including sophisticated alloying practices, heat treatment methods, and decorative techniques that required highly specialized knowledge and skills. The study of textile remains from Viking Age context has similarly revealed levels of technological sophistication and artistic achievement that were previously underappreciated. The analysis of fabric fragments preserved in metal corrosion or waterlogged deposits has documented the production of high-quality textiles using complex weaving techniques, sophisticated dyeing processes, and decorative methods that created some of medieval Europe's finest fabrics. The investigation of Viking Age urban centers has provided crucial insights into the social and economic organization that supported Scandinavian expansion and settlement. Excavations at sites like Jorvik, York, Dublin, and Birka have revealed sophisticated craft production areas, extensive trading facilities, and complex residential districts that house diverse populations engaged in specialized economic activities. The comparative study of Viking Age urban centers across different regions has revealed the remarkable adaptability of Scandinavian communities to varied geographical and cultural environments. A trading post at Birka in Sweden developed into a cosmopolitan commercial hub that connected Baltic amber and fur producers with merchants from throughout Europe and beyond, while the fortress town of Hedeby in Denmark served as a crucial link between Scandinavian, Slavic, and Frankish commercial networks. The archaeological evidence from these urban centers demonstrates that Viking Age communities possessed sophisticated understanding of urban planning, waste management, and infrastructure development that enabled them to create functional cities in remarkably short periods of time. The rapid growth of Dublin, from a seasonal raiding base to a major commercial center within a few decades, illustrates the organizational capabilities that supported Scandinavian urban development. The preservation of organic materials in waterlogged urban deposits has provided unprecedented insights into the daily life of Viking Age townspeople, including evidence for diet, clothing, personal hygiene, and recreational activities that are rarely documented in formal historical sources. The leather shoes, wooden combs, gaming pieces, and food remains recovered from sites like York reveal the material culture that surrounded ordinary people living in Viking Age communities. The study of Viking Age coinage has provided valuable information about the commercial and political relationships that connected Scandinavian communities with the broader medieval world. The analysis of coin hoards buried throughout the Viking territories reveals the flow of silver from Islamic and Byzantine sources through Scandinavian trade networks, while also documenting the gradual development of indigenous Scandinavian monetary systems. The appearance of coins, bearing the names and images of Scandinavian rulers, marks important stages in the political development of Viking Age kingdoms. As local rulers asserted their authority through the symbolic act of minting currency, the coins of Canute the Great, struck in mints throughout his North Sea empire, demonstrate how Viking rulers learned to employ the symbolic vocabulary of established European kingship to legitimize their authority. The investigation of Viking Age religious practices has revealed the complex process through which Scandinavian communities adapted to Christianity while preserving important elements of their traditional cultural identity. Archaeological evidence from conversion period sites shows that pagan and Christian symbols often appeared together on the same artifacts, suggesting syncretic religious beliefs rather than simple replacement of old traditions with new ones. Famous hammer cross pendants found throughout Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries exemplify this religious synthesis. These ornaments, which could be interpreted as either Thor's hammer or Christian cross, depending on their orientation, allowed wearers to demonstrate allegiance to both traditional and innovative religious systems while avoiding potential conflicts with either pagan or Christian authorities. The gradual transformation of traditional Norse festivals into Christian celebrations created opportunities for preserving seasonal customs and community traditions within new religious frameworks. The winter solstice celebrations that became incorporated into Christmas observances, the spring fertility rituals that were adapted for Easter, and the harvest festivals that were transformed into saints' days demonstrate how communities maintained cultural continuity while accommodating new religious requirements. The development of distinctively Scandinavian forms of Christian art and architecture created visual traditions that celebrated both religious devotion and cultural identity. The intricate stone carvings that decorated medieval Scandinavian churches often combined Christian themes with traditional Norse decorative motifs, creating artistic programs that spoke to both spiritual and cultural concerns. The manuscript illumination traditions that developed in medieval Scandinavian monasteries similarly blended Christian iconography with indigenous artistic styles to create distinctive regional variations of European religious art. The decorated initials and marginal decorations found in manuscripts from Swedish and Danish scriptoriums often include traditional animal interlace, patterns, and mythological motifs that maintained connections to pre-Christian artistic traditions. The preservation of Viking Age literary traditions through medieval manuscript culture created one of Europe's most remarkable bodies of vernacular literature. The Icelandic sagas, with their sophisticated narrative techniques and psychological realism, influenced European literary development, while also preserving authentic details about Viking Age society, law, and culture that would otherwise have been lost to oral tradition's gradual erosion. The poetic traditions preserved in the Poetic Edda provide our most direct access to pre-Christian Scandinavian mythology and religious beliefs, offering insights into the cosmological concepts and moral values that had shaped Viking Age society. These ancient poems, transmitted through oral tradition for centuries before being recorded in writing, reveal a sophisticated theological system that addressed fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the relationship between gods and humans, and the ultimate destiny of the cosmos. The legal traditions documented in medieval Scandinavian law codes preserve important evidence for the democratic institutions and individual rights concepts that had characterized Viking Age. Political culture. The provisions for popular assemblies, jury trials, and legal compensation that appear in these codes demonstrate the persistence of traditional legal concepts even as they were adapted to accommodate Christian moral teaching and royal administrative requirements. The linguistic legacy of Viking expansion continued to influence the development of European languages long after the political dominance of Scandinavian communities had ended. The hundreds of Old Norse loanwords that entered English during the Viking Age permanently altered the vocabulary and grammatical structure of what would become one of the world's most widely spoken languages. While similar influences affected the development of Gaelic, Russian, and other languages throughout the regions of Viking settlement, the place name evidence for Viking settlement provides perhaps the most enduring testament to Scandinavian cultural influence, as the names given to geographical features, settlements, and administrative districts by Viking Age communities have survived political changes, population replacements, and linguistic transformations that eliminated other traces of Scandinavian presence. The thousands of place names ending in by, Thorpe, Thwaite, and other Norse elements throughout northern England, Scotland, and Ireland continue to mark the landscape with evidence of Viking cultural influence. The modern rediscovery of Viking achievements through archaeological investigation and scholarly research has created new appreciation for the remarkable cultural accomplishments of medieval Scandinavian civilization. The recognition that Vikings were not merely raiders and pirates, but also accomplished explorers, traders, craftsmen, poets, and political innovators has transformed understanding of their historical significance and continuing relevance. Contemporary study of Viking Age society has provided valuable insights into the processes of cultural adaptation, technological innovation, and social organization that enabled relatively small populations to achieve remarkable feats of exploration and settlement. These historical lessons have particular relevance for understanding how societies can successfully adapt to environmental challenges, cultural diversity, and technological change. The environmental lessons learned from the Viking experience with climate change and resource management have particular relevance for contemporary global challenges. The collapse of the Greenland colonies during the Little Ice Age provides a sobering example of how even well-established communities can become vulnerable when environmental conditions change beyond their adaptive capacity. Yet the successful adaptation of Icelandic society to similar climatic challenges demonstrates that communities with flexible social institutions and diverse economic strategies can survive even traumatic environmental transformations. The technological innovations developed during the Viking Age continue to influence modern design and engineering approaches, particularly in areas related to maritime technology, cold weather construction, and sustainable resource utilization. The principles of ship design that made Viking vessels simultaneously strong and lightweight have inspired modern yacht and small craft construction, while the building techniques that enabled Norse communities to create durable structures in harsh climates have informed contemporary approaches to Arctic architecture. The social innovations that characterized Viking Age communities, including their emphasis on legal procedure, democratic participation, and individual rights balanced against collective responsibilities, provided important precedents for the development of modern Scandinavian social democracy. The political traditions that emerged from Viking Age thing assemblies evolved through medieval and early modern periods to create the distinctive forms of constitutional government that characterize contemporary Nordic societies. The cultural achievements of the Viking Age continue to inspire contemporary artistic and literary expression throughout the world. The themes of exploration, adventure, and cultural encounter that characterize Viking literature remain relevant for modern audiences, while the artistic traditions that developed during the medieval period continue to influence Scandinavian design, craftsmanship, and cultural identity. The international character of Viking Age society, with its remarkable openness to cultural exchange and its successful integration of diverse populations, provides valuable models for contemporary efforts to create inclusive communities that can benefit from cultural diversity while maintaining social cohesion. The archaeological evidence for ethnic diversity within Viking communities challenges simplistic notions of cultural purity while demonstrating How successful societies can emerge from the creative synthesis of different traditions. The economic strategies that enabled Viking communities to thrive in marginal environments offer important lessons for sustainable development in challenging geographical and climatic conditions. The combination of diversified subsistence strategies, flexible resource management, and extensive trade networks that supported communities like those in Iceland and Greenland demonstrates approaches to economic development that could inform contemporary efforts to create resilient local economies. The educational value of Viking Age studies extends beyond their historical significance to include important lessons about research methodology, interdisciplinary cooperation, and the integration of different types of evidence to create comprehensive understanding of complex cultural phenomena. The collaborative approaches that have developed in Viking Age scholarship provide models for academic cooperation that could benefit other fields, facing similar challenges in synthesizing diverse forms of evidence. The preservation challenges that face Viking Age archaeological sites and artifact collections highlight the ongoing responsibility that contemporary societies bear for protecting and maintaining access to their cultural heritage. The destruction of irreplaceable sites through development pressure, environmental change, and inadequate conservation resources represents losses that diminish understanding not only of Viking culture, but of human achievement more broadly. The digital preservation projects that are now creating comprehensive online archives of Viking Age manuscripts, archaeological data, and scholarly research represent crucial efforts to ensure that future generations will have access to these cultural resources regardless of the physical preservation challenges facing original materials. These initiatives demonstrate how modern technology can be employed to serve traditional scholarly and cultural preservation goals. The popular interest in Viking culture that has emerged through television programs, historical fiction, and other forms of entertainment has created new opportunities for public education, while also presenting challenges related to historical accuracy and cultural sensitivity. The responsibility that scholars bear for engaging with public interest in Viking culture requires careful balance between accessibility and accuracy, ensuring that popular presentations contribute to genuine understanding rather than perpetuating misconceptions. The international cooperation that characterizes contemporary Viking Age research reflects the global significance of Scandinavian cultural achievements and demonstrates how scholarly investigation can transcend national boundaries to create shared understanding of human cultural development. The research collaborations that bring together scholars from throughout Europe and North America to investigate Viking sites and materials provide models for international academic cooperation that could benefit other fields of historical and archaeological research. The continuing discovery of new Viking Age sites and materials through construction projects, environmental changes, and systematic survey work ensures that our understanding of Scandinavian medieval culture will continue to evolve and deepen. The recent discoveries of major ship burials, urban centers, and settlement sites demonstrate that much remains to be learned about Viking society and that future research will undoubtedly revise and expand current knowledge. The technological advances in analytical techniques, including improved dating methods, genetic analysis, and materials science applications, continue to provide new tools for investigating Viking Age culture that enable researchers to extract information from archaeological materials that was previously inaccessible. These methodological developments ensure that existing collections will continue to yield new insights while also improving the quality of information that can be recovered from newly discovered sites. The global perspective that has emerged in Viking Age studies, recognizing the connections between Scandinavian expansion and contemporaneous developments throughout Europe, Asia, and beyond, has created more comprehensive understanding of how Viking culture both influenced and was influenced by the broader patterns of medieval cultural development. This international framework provides crucial context for understanding why Scandinavian expansion occurred when and how it did, while also illuminating the lasting significance of Viking achievements for world history. The legacy of Viking Age. Exploration continues to inspire contemporary efforts to understand and explore unknown territories, whether geographical, technological, or intellectual. The combination of practical skill, cultural adaptability, and courage that enabled Vikings to achieve remarkable voyages of discovery provides enduring models for human exploration and achievement that transcend specific historical circumstances. The ethical dimensions of Viking Age studies raise important questions about how contemporary societies should understand and remember cultures that combined remarkable achievements with practices that modern sensibilities find disturbing. The Viking involvement in slavery, their sometimes brutal military tactics, and their destruction of religious and cultural sites represent aspects of their legacy that require careful historical contextualization rather than simple condemnation or celebration. The scholarly approach to these ethical challenges involves recognizing that historical cultures must be understood within their own contexts, while also acknowledging that modern societies have obligations to learn from both the positive and negative aspects of past human experiences. The Viking example demonstrates how societies capable of remarkable creativity and achievement can also engage in practices that cause tremendous human suffering, providing important lessons about the complexity of human nature and social organization. This feminist scholarship that has emerged in Viking Age studies during recent decades has revealed the significant roles that women played in Scandinavian expansion and settlement, while also highlighting the gender-based limitations and opportunities that characterized medieval Northern European society. The archaeological evidence for female warriors, merchants, and religious leaders has challenged traditional assumptions about gender roles, while also providing more nuanced understanding of how Viking society organized itself around both cooperation and competition between men and women. The study of childhood and family life in Viking Age society has similarly revealed aspects of Scandinavian culture that were previously invisible in historical sources focused primarily on the activities of adult male elites. Archaeological evidence from domestic contexts, combined with careful analysis of legal codes and literary sources, has provided insights into child-rearing practices, educational systems, and family structures that influence the development of individuals who would later participate in exploration, trade, and settlement activities. The comparative study of Viking Age culture with other contemporaneous civilizations has illuminated both the distinctive characteristics of Scandinavian society and the broader patterns of medieval cultural development that connected different regions of Europe, Asia, and Africa through trade networks, religious movements, and political relationships. This comparative perspective has revealed that many aspects of Viking culture that were once considered uniquely Scandinavian actually reflected broader medieval developments in areas such as urbanization, commercialization, and religious transformation. The influence of climate and environmental factors on Viking Age cultural development has become increasingly apparent as researchers have gained better understanding of the medieval warm period and its effects on agricultural productivity, navigation, conditions, and resource availability. The recognition that environmental changes helped create the conditions that enabled Viking expansion, while also ultimately contributing to its decline, has provided important insights into the relationship between human societies and natural systems. The archaeological investigation of Viking Age environmental management practices has revealed sophisticated approaches to resource utilization that enabled communities to maintain sustainable relationships with their natural environments over extended periods. The farming techniques developed in Iceland, the forest management practices employed in Norway, and the marine resource exploitation strategies used throughout the North Atlantic demonstrate levels of ecological knowledge that enabled long-term community survival in challenging environments. The study of Viking Age disease and health patterns has provided insights into the demographic and social factors that influenced Scandinavian expansion and settlement. The analysis of skeletal remains from burial sites throughout the Viking world has revealed information about life expectancy, disease prevalence, and nutritional status that helps explain why some communities thrived while others failed to establish permanent settlements. The investigation of Viking Age craft, production, and technological innovation has revealed the sophisticated knowledge base that supported Scandinavian material culture and enabled communities to create the tools, weapons, and other equipment necessary for successful exploration and settlement. The metalworking techniques that produced superior steel, the shipbuilding knowledge that created remarkably seaworthy vessels, and the textile production skills that created durable and beautiful fabrics, all contributed to Viking cultural achievements. The preservation of traditional ecological knowledge within Viking Age communities enabled them to adapt successfully to diverse environmental conditions throughout their expansion territories. The understanding of seasonal cycles, weather patterns, navigation techniques, and resource management strategies that was transmitted through oral tradition and practical experience provided the foundation for successful settlement in regions ranging from the subarctic to the Mediterranean. The role of storytelling and oral tradition in preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge during the Viking Age demonstrates the sophisticated information management systems that preliterate societies could develop to maintain community memory and cultural identity across generations, and narrative techniques that preserved historical memories, technical knowledge, and moral teachings provided crucial foundations for the literary achievements that would later be recorded in manuscript collections. The transformation of Viking Age warrior culture into medieval chivalric ideals illustrates how cultural values and behavioral expectations evolved in response to changing social and political circumstances. The emphasis on honor, loyalty, and martial prowess that characterized Viking society provided important precedents for the knightly ideals that would dominate European aristocratic culture during the High Middle Ages. The integration of Scandinavian artistic traditions with European Christian culture created distinctive regional variations of medieval art that combined traditional motifs with new religious and cultural meanings. The stone crosses, wooden sculptures, and manuscript decorations produced in Viking Age communities demonstrate how cultural synthesis could create innovative artistic forms that preserved traditional skills while serving new cultural purposes. Development of written legal codes during the later Viking Age represented crucial steps in the evolution from oral tradition to documentary culture that would characterize the transition to medieval European civilization. The preservation of traditional legal concepts within new written frameworks created possibilities for maintaining cultural continuity while adapting to changing political and social requirements. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through the Viking Age, we can see that the transformation from raiders to explorers, from seasonal warriors to settled communities, from pagan chieftains to Christian kings, represents one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural adaptation and achievement. The Vikings began as products of specific geographical and historical circumstances in early medieval Scandinavia, but their legacy transcended those origins to influence the development of European civilization and, ultimately, world culture in ways that continue to resonate today. The enduring fascination with Viking culture reflects something deeper than mere historical curiosity or romantic nostalgia. In the Vikings, we encounter a people who embodied fundamental human qualities that transcend specific historical circumstances. The courage to venture into unknown territories, the ingenuity to adapt to challenging environments, the creativity to build new forms of social organization, and the wisdom to preserve what was valuable from their heritage while embracing beneficial innovations from other cultures. The geographical scope of Viking achievement remains breathtaking, even by contemporary standards. From the windswept shores of Greenland to the golden domes of Constantinople, from the frozen rivers of Russia to the sunny coasts of Sicily, Viking ships carried not only warriors and merchants, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that enriched every society they encountered. Their ability to traverse vast distances and adapt to radically different environments demonstrates a flexibility and resilience that enabled them to thrive in circumstances that would have defeated less adaptable peoples. The temporal scope of Viking influence proves equally impressive. The cultural, legal, and linguistic changes they initiated during their 3 centuries of expansion continued to shape European development for a millennium after the last Viking raid. The democratic traditions they fostered, the commercial networks they established, and the exploration techniques they pioneered provided foundations for developments that would eventually transform the entire world. The intellectual legacy of Viking culture extends beyond their practical achievements to include fundamental contributions to literature, law, and political philosophy that continue to influence contemporary thought. The saga literature they created established narrative techniques and psychological insights that influenced the development of the novel as a literary form. The legal concepts they developed provided crucial precedents for the emergence of democratic institutions and individual rights. The political traditions they fostered demonstrated how societies could balance individual achievement with collective responsibility. The technological innovations that enabled Viking success, from their revolutionary ship designs to their sophisticated metallurgical techniques, represented solutions to practical problems that required both theoretical understanding and creative application of available resources. Their ability to push the boundaries of what was possible with available materials and knowledge demonstrates an engineering mindset that sought elegant solutions to complex challenges. The social innovations that characterized Viking communities proved equally important for their long-term success. Their ability to integrate diverse populations, to maintain cultural identity while adapting to new circumstances, and to create institutions that could function effectively in varied environments demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human social dynamics and organizational requirements. The environmental wisdom embedded in Viking cultural practices enabled them to establish sustainable relationships with natural systems that supported their communities over extended periods. Their understanding of seasonal cycles, resource management, and ecological relationships reflected generations of accumulated knowledge about how human societies could thrive within natural limitations, rather than attempting to transcend them through technological dominance. The artistic achievements of Viking culture reveal aesthetic sensibilities that combined respect for traditional forms with openness to innovative influences from other cultures. Their ability to create objects that were simultaneously functional and beautiful, practical and symbolic, demonstrates an integrated approach to material culture that recognized no fundamental separation between utility and artistry. The religious and philosophical dimensions of Viking culture provided frameworks for understanding human existence that addressed fundamental questions about meaning, morality, and cosmic order. Their mythological systems, though eventually superseded by Christianity, preserved insights about human nature and social relationships that continued to influence cultural development long after their specific religious practices had been abandoned. The educational systems that developed within Viking communities, though based primarily on oral tradition and practical apprenticeship, proved remarkably effective at transmitting the complex knowledge base required for successful expansion and settlement. Their ability to preserve and communicate technical skills, cultural values, and historical memories across generations without written documentation demonstrates the power of well-organized oral culture, not the economic strategies that support it. Viking expansion combined traditional subsistence practices with innovative commercial activities that created wealth and opportunities for entire communities. Their understanding of market forces, resource distribution, and commercial organization enabled them to participate successfully in international trading networks while maintaining local economic stability. The military innovations that made Viking expansion possible reflected not merely technological superiority, but also sophisticated understanding of logistics, strategy, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. Their ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances while maintaining effective communication and supply lines demonstrated organizational capabilities that rivaled those of much larger and more centralized states. The diplomatic skills that characterized later Viking political development enabled them to participate successfully in the complex international relationships that governed medieval European politics. Their transformation from external raiders to integral participants in European civilization required cultural and political adaptability that demonstrated remarkable sophistication and wisdom. The family and kinship systems that provided social foundations for Viking communities created networks of obligation and support that enabled individuals to undertake risky ventures while maintaining connections to stable home bases. Their understanding of how to balance individual ambition with collective security provided crucial social infrastructure for expansion activities. The legal traditions that governed Viking communities created frameworks for resolving conflicts and organizing collective activities that proved adaptable to varied circumstances, while maintaining essential principles of fairness and individual rights. Their contribution to the development of European legal systems represents one of their most enduring and beneficial legacies. The archaeological record that preserves evidence of Viking achievement continues to yield new insights as improving. Analytical techniques enable researchers to extract information that was previously inaccessible. Each new discovery adds details to our understanding, while also raising new questions that ensure Viking Age studies will remain an active and evolving field of scholarly investigation. The preservation challenges that face Viking heritage sites and artifact collections remind us that our connection to this remarkable culture depends on continued efforts to protect and maintain the physical evidence that enables ongoing research and public education. The responsibility to preserve these cultural resources for future generations represents an ongoing obligation that requires sustained commitment and adequate resources. The educational value of Viking Age studies extends far beyond historical curiosity to include practical lessons about cultural adaptation, technological innovation, environmental management, and social organization that remain relevant for contemporary challenges. The Viking example demonstrates how relatively small populations can achieve remarkable results through effective organization, technological innovation, and cultural flexibility. The inspiration that Viking achievements continue to provide for contemporary exploration, whether geographical, technological, or intellectual, reflects the enduring appeal of their combination of practical skill, cultural adaptability, and willingness to venture into unknown territories. Their legacy encourages us to approach our own challenges with similar courage, creativity, and determination. As we drift toward sleep with these images of dragon-prowed ships cutting through northern seas, of explorers discovering new lands, beyond distant horizons, of communities building new lives in challenging environments, we can appreciate the remarkable human capacity for achievement that the Vikings exemplified. Their story reminds us that human societies, when organized around effective institutions and animated by shared purposes, can accomplish feats that seem impossible when measured against the limitations of individual capabilities. The Vikings, transformed themselves from local Scandinavian raiders into explorers whose achievements rank among humanity's greatest adventures. In doing so, they demonstrated that cultural boundaries are not permanent barriers, but rather challenges that can be overcome through courage, wisdom, and perseverance. Their legacy continues to inspire us to push beyond familiar territories, whether geographical or intellectual, and to approach unknown challenges with the confidence that human ingenuity and determination can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. In the end, the story of the Vikings is not merely about one remarkable culture from Europe's medieval past, but about the enduring human capacity for exploration, adaptation, and achievement that they exemplified so dramatically. As their ships disappear into the mists of history, they leave behind not only archaeological remains and written records, but also an enduring testament to what human societies can accomplish when they combine practical wisdom with adventurous spirits, technological innovation with cultural sensitivity, and individual achievement with collective purpose. Sleep now, and dream of distant shores waiting to be discovered, of challenges that test human ingenuity, and of the remarkable legacy left by a people who dared to venture beyond the known world, and, in doing so, expanded the boundaries of human possibility for all who would follow in their wake.